A room built for mourning became a stage for humiliation. The moment Larry Bennett stood up smiling before his late father's will had even been fully read. In front of attorneys, directors, and grieving relatives, he laughed at his wife, Claire Evans Bennett, calling her a temporary guest who would soon lose everything. He celebrated an inheritance he believed was already his. Never noticing the quiet woman beside him, never argued, never cried, and never corrected him. What Larry could not possibly know was that the final authority over Richard Bennett's last wishes had never belonged to him. Before the day ended, the law, not anger, would reveal who truly held the last word. Before we begin, I'd love to know where you're watching from and what your local time is right now. If you believe dignity is measured by actions rather than loud words, share your location in the comments and consider subscribing so you won't miss the next story where patience and truth quietly find their rightful place. Claire Evans Bennett had long ago learned that silence often revealed more than argument ever could. The people who barely knew her mistook that silence for weakness. Those who worked beside her understood it differently. Claire listened before she spoke. She watched before she acted. She wrote everything down, not because she distrusted memory, but because facts survived long after emotions faded. That habit had begun years before she met Larry Bennett. Growing up in Columbus, Ohio, Claire was the daughter of a public school teacher and a certified accountant. There had never been extraordinary wealth in her childhood home, but there had always been discipline. Her father believed every promise should be documented. Her mother believed character was measured by what someone did when no one was watching. Those lessons followed Claire into adulthood. She graduated near the top of her university class with degrees in business administration and corporate compliance. While many of her classmates pursued glamorous careers in investment banking, Claire accepted a quieter position specializing in internal governance and organizational risk management. It wasn't the kind of work that made headlines, but it taught her how companies truly functioned beneath polished annual reports and confident executive speeches. She learned one lesson especially well. The greatest disasters rarely began with dramatic crimes. They began with small decisions that people believed no one would ever notice. Years later, at a charity fundraiser supporting children's hospitals, Claire met Larry Bennett. Larry possessed the effortless confidence that came from growing up inside privilege. He was handsome, articulate, and quick with charming stories about expanding Bennett Holdings into new markets. Reporters enjoyed interviewing him. Investors liked hearing him speak. Employees admired the certainty in his voice. At least, that was the version most people saw. Claire noticed something different. Whenever someone else received praise, Larry redirected the conversation toward himself. Whenever a volunteer made a mistake, his smile disappeared for just a second before returning for the cameras. Whenever an employee thanked an entire team, Larry subtly corrected the wording until the achievement sounded personal. They were small moments, almost invisible. Claire noticed them because noticing details had become second nature. Still, people are rarely defined by isolated moments. She believed everyone deserved the opportunity to become better. Their relationship moved steadily rather than dramatically. Larry appreciated Claire's intelligence because she simplified complicated business issues. Claire admired what she believed was Larry's ambition. Richard Bennett, Larry's father and founder of Bennett Holdings, welcomed her warmly during their first dinner together. Unlike his son, Richard asked questions that required listening. "What matters most to you?" he had asked. Claire answered without hesitation. "Being able to sleep peacefully because I handled today, honestly." Richard studied her for several quiet seconds before smiling. "I hope you never lose that." At the time, she assumed it was ordinary conversation. Only years later would she understand how carefully Richard observed every answer people gave. Their wedding was elegant, without becoming extravagant. Business leaders attended alongside family friends. Newspapers published photographs describing the marriage as the union of one of the state's most influential business families with an accomplished young professional. The articles praised Larry's future. They barely mentioned Claire. That suited her perfectly. For the first 2 years, their marriage appeared successful. Claire continued working while occasionally helping review internal compliance procedures at Bennett Holdings whenever Richard requested a second opinion. She never sought authority inside the company. She never asked for an executive position. Whenever Richard thanked her for identifying operational risks, she quietly returned to her own responsibilities. Larry initially admired that restraint. Over time, however, admiration slowly transformed into something less generous. He began interpreting humility as a lack of ambition. "You could have anything here," he once told her during dinner. "I already have meaningful work. You don't want more. I want enough." Larry laughed. Nobody builds an empire by wanting enough. Claire smiled politely. "Maybe not. But people sometimes lose one because they never know when enough is enough." Larry dismissed the comment with another laugh. To him, success was measured by expansion acquisitions, headlines, and market value. To Claire, success meant leaving behind fewer problems than she inherited. The difference seemed philosophical at first. Eventually, it became personal. As Bennett Holdings expanded across several states, Larry became increasingly occupied with public appearances, investor conferences, and interviews. Newspapers frequently described him as the inevitable successor to Richard Bennett. The phrase appeared so often that even employees began repeating it. Future CEO, next chairman, natural heir. Larry embraced every title. Richard never confirmed any of them. Inside company headquarters, Richard maintained the same routine he had followed for decades. He arrived early, greeted receptionists by name, visited different departments without warning, and occasionally ate lunch in the employee cafeteria instead of the executive dining room. Claire noticed something else. Richard spent more time observing than speaking. He listened during meetings without interrupting. He watched who credited colleagues. He watched who accepted responsibility after mistakes. Most people assumed he was simply growing quieter with age. Claire suspected otherwise. One autumn afternoon, Richard invited Claire into his office after reviewing a compliance report she had prepared. "It isn't often someone tells me bad news this clearly," he said. Claire looked slightly confused. "It wasn't good news." "Exactly." Richard folded the report carefully. Most executives spend hours trying to make unpleasant facts sound comfortable. "I don't think facts should be comfortable." "No," he nodded thoughtfully. "They should simply be true." That conversation lasted less than 15 minutes. Neither of them realized Daniel Brooks, Richard's longtime executive assistant, would remember it years later, almost word for word. Daniel had worked beside Richard for nearly 25 years. He knew his employer better than almost anyone. He also knew Richard rarely complimented people directly. When he did, he meant every word. Meanwhile, Larry's confidence continued growing. He increasingly referred to Bennett Holdings as though ownership had already transferred. "Our company, my future board, my executive team, my expansion strategy." Richard never corrected him publicly. Neither did Claire. Silence, however, did not always mean agreement. Sometimes it simply meant someone was still collecting information. Claire had developed another quiet routine. Each evening before going to sleep, she wrote brief notes in a leather journal she kept inside a locked drawer. Nothing dramatic. Dates, meetings, promises, unexpected remarks, financial conversations, changes in behavior. She never imagined those observations would someday matter outside her own reflections. She simply believed accuracy deserved consistency. Larry occasionally teased her about the habit. "You'd make a terrible spy." "Why? You write everything down." Claire smiled. "People usually forget what they actually said. I don't. You remember your version." Larry laughed again, assuming she was joking. She wasn't. Months gradually became years. The marriage remained outwardly stable. Holiday photographs still appeared on social media. Business magazines still praised Larry's leadership potential. Family dinners still took place inside Richard Bennett's large estate overlooking the river. Yet beneath every polished surface, tiny fractures had already begun spreading. Richard noticed them. Daniel noticed them. Margaret Sullivan, the Bennett family's attorney for more than 3 decades, noticed them as well. None of them spoke openly. Not yet. Because experience had taught them another truth. Character does not reveal itself during success. It reveals itself when people begin believing consequences no longer apply to them. Larry had started believing exactly that. And Richard Bennett, though already carrying the burden of declining health, was watching every decision his only son made with increasing disappointment. Claire never asked what Richard was thinking. She simply noticed that every conversation between father and son grew slightly shorter than the one before. Every silence inside the Bennett family was becoming heavier. No one at the dinner table acknowledged it aloud. No one needed to. The future of an empire had quietly become uncertain long before Richard Bennett's health began to fail. Only one person in that family understood that the most important decisions were no longer being made inside boardrooms. They were being made inside the heart of an aging father who had begun asking himself a painful question. Could the son he loved also be the man he could no longer trust? The first unmistakable sign that Richard Bennett's health was failing did not come during a board meeting. It came when he forgot the name of a man who had worked beside him for almost 20 years. The room fell unusually quiet. Richard recovered a moment later, apologizing with a warm smile, before continuing the meeting as though nothing had happened. Most executives accepted the explanation that exhaustion had finally caught up with the 74-year-old founder of Bennett Holdings. Claire Evans Bennett noticed something different. Richard never forgot names. Not receptionists, not security guards, not delivery drivers, certainly not senior executives. She said nothing. That evening after dinner at the Bennett estate, Richard remained seated in the library while everyone else moved toward the living room for coffee. Claire was gathering empty glasses when she heard him speak softly. "Would you stay for a minute?" She turned back. "Of course." Richard gestured toward the leather chair across from him. "When was the last time you had a physical examination?" Claire blinked, surprised by the question. "About 6 months ago." He nodded approvingly. "Don't postpone the next one." "I won't." A faint smile crossed his face. "People assume time is generous." He paused. "It rarely is." Claire sensed that the conversation had little to do with annual checkups. She waited. Richard looked toward the fireplace before speaking again. "My doctor says I should reduce my schedule." "I'm sorry to hear that." "I've ignored him for almost a year." "Will you listen now?" "I think I have to." His voice carried neither fear nor self-pity, only acceptance. Claire did not respond with comforting promises. She had spent enough years studying people to understand that some truths deserved quiet acknowledgement instead of immediate reassurance. "If there's anything I can help with," she said, "please let me know." Richard looked at her for several seconds. "You've been helping more than you realize." Before Claire could ask what he meant, Larry entered the library while checking messages on his phone. "There you are?" He barely looked away from the screen. "Dad's Chicago investors moved the presentation to Thursday." Richard nodded. "Fine. They want you there. I may not travel." Larry finally looked up. You have to. I don't. Dad, appearances matter. Richard smiled faintly. So does health. Larry sighed impatiently. We'll talk tomorrow. Without waiting for a reply, he walked away, already returning another phone call before reaching the hallway. Silence settled over the library once again. Richard watched the doorway for a long moment. Then he quietly said, almost to himself, "He used to ask how I was feeling." Claire lowered her eyes. She knew there was no answer capable of easing that realization. Over the following months, Richard's medical appointments became increasingly frequent. At first, Larry attended several consultations. Soon, business obligations began replacing him. Then investor meetings, then conferences, then international travel. Every absence came with a reasonable explanation. Each explanation sounded perfectly logical. Taken together, they created an uncomfortable pattern. Claire noticed because she was usually the one sitting beside Richard in waiting rooms. She organized appointment schedules. She reviewed medication instructions. She kept copies of medical reports inside clearly labeled folders. Whenever specialists recommended changes in treatment, Claire asked careful questions until she fully understood every instruction. Richard appreciated that. "You remind me of your father," he once said while they waited outside an oncology clinic. Claire looked surprised. "You've never met him." "I didn't have to." "You can tell." "I can." Richard smiled gently. People who respect details usually learn that respect from someone. Claire smiled back. "My father always said paperwork tells the truth long after memories begin arguing." Richard laughed quietly. "He sounds like someone I would have hired." Daniel Brooks noticed the growing routine as well. As Richard's executive assistant, Daniel adjusted countless schedules to accommodate treatments. He often saw Claire arriving before appointments with organized files already prepared. He also noticed something else. She never mentioned her efforts to anyone. Not to employees, not to friends, certainly not to Larry. One afternoon, Daniel accidentally overheard two senior managers discussing Richard's health. "I heard Larry's practically running the company now." "That's what everyone says." Daniel said nothing. He knew appearances often concealed realities. Richard still reviewed every major decision. He simply did so from quieter places. Sometimes a hospital room, sometimes his study, sometimes the sunroom overlooking the gardens behind his estate. Wherever Richard happened to be, Claire frequently arrived carrying neatly organized folders, never seeking attention, simply making difficult days slightly easier. Meanwhile, Larry's confidence continued expanding alongside his public profile. Business magazines increasingly referred to him as the future of Bennett Holdings. Television interviews portrayed him as a visionary executive, preparing the company for its next generation. Larry enjoyed every headline. He began speaking less about Richard's leadership and more about his own plans. "We're entering a new era. My strategy. My direction. My leadership." Employees noticed the subtle change in language. Some admired it. Others exchanged cautious glances. Richard noticed all of it. He rarely commented. One rainy afternoon, Richard requested a private meeting with Margaret Sullivan, the Bennett family's attorney for over 30 years. The meeting took place inside Richard's home office. Only 3 people entered: Richard, Margaret, Daniel Brooks. The heavy oak door remained closed for almost 2 hours. No one else knew what was discussed. When Margaret finally emerged, she carried a thick sealed folder instead of the slim briefcase she had brought inside. Daniel escorted her to the front entrance. Before leaving, Margaret stopped. "Daniel." "Yes." Everything discussed today remains confidential. Of course. She studied him carefully. There may come a day when people question what Richard decided. Daniel answered without hesitation. I'll tell the truth. Margaret nodded once. That's why he trusts you. She walked away. Daniel watched her car disappear through the gates. He had served Richard faithfully for decades. Yet even he did not know every detail inside that sealed folder. Claire noticed another subtle change. Richard began asking unusual questions, not about quarterly earnings, not about expansion, about people. If someone disappoints you once, he asked during lunch one afternoon, do you stop trusting them? Claire thought carefully before answering. Not immediately. What changes your mind? A pattern. Richard nodded slowly. And if the pattern continues, then eventually you're no longer responding to one mistake. She looked toward him. You're responding to who they've chosen to become. Richard remained silent. His expression suggested the answer had settled somewhere much deeper than of the conversation itself. As summer turned into autumn, Richard's condition worsened. Walking became slower, meetings became shorter. Fatigue lingered longer after each treatment. Still, he insisted on visiting company headquarters at least once every week. Employees greeted him warmly. Many had worked beside him for decades. Richard remembered birthdays, children's names, anniversaries, small acts of kindness. He stopped near the reception desk one afternoon to congratulate a young employee on completing 10 years with the company. Larry happened to witness the interaction. Dad, he said once they entered the elevator, you don't have to spend time remembering everyone's personal life. Richard looked calmly at his son. I don't have to. So why do it? Because they remember mine. Larry shrugged. They're employees. Richard answered quietly. They're people. Neither man spoke for the remainder of the elevator ride. Claire, standing beside them, silently watched the reflection in the polished metal doors. One father, one son, two entirely different ideas of leadership. Several weeks later, Richard suffered a medical setback, severe enough to require an extended hospital stay. Larry visited briefly the first evening before leaving for an important investor dinner. Claire stayed until nearly midnight. The following morning, she returned before sunrise. A nurse approached Richard's bed while reviewing medications. Your daughter is here. The nurse smiled warmly toward Claire. Richard gently corrected her. My daughter-in-law. The nurse apologized. Richard shook his head. No apology necessary. He looked at Claire. Sometimes family isn't defined by the word people use. Claire felt unexpectedly emotional, but simply smiled. She adjusted his blanket before helping him review the day's treatment schedule. Outside the hospital window, autumn leaves drifted quietly across the parking lot. Inside the room, neither of them noticed Daniel Brooks speaking softly with Margaret Sullivan in the hallway. The documents are ready, Margaret said. Daniel glanced toward Richard's room. Has he made his final decision? Margaret looked through the small glass window at Richard and Claire discussing medication instructions. He made it months ago. Daniel frowned slightly. And Larry? Margaret closed the folder in her hands. Larry still believes inheritance is decided by blood. She turned toward the elevator. Richard believes it's protected by character. Neither of them realized that the choice Richard had already made would soon reshape every relationship inside the Bennett family and transform Claire Evans Bennett from the woman everyone overlooked into the person whose signature would eventually determine the fate of an entire legacy. Richard Bennett returned home from the hospital just before Thanksgiving. The doctors called it a positive development. Richard called it borrowed time. Claire Evans Bennett noticed the difference between those two descriptions immediately. One reflected medical optimism. The other reflected quiet acceptance. She helped Daniel Brooks arrange a temporary office in Richard's sunroom overlooking the gardens. The room received warm afternoon light, making it easier for Richard to work without the harsh brightness of the executive floor downtown. Boxes of contracts, financial reports, and board documents arrived every morning. Richard continued reading every page. His signature still carried legal authority. His judgment remained sharp. Only his body had begun refusing to cooperate. Larry Bennett interpreted the situation differently. To him, his father's reduced schedule meant the transition of power had already begun. He started making decisions more aggressively. Sometimes he informed Richard afterward. Sometimes he didn't. At first, the changes seemed harmless. A new marketing campaign, an executive restructuring proposal, several expensive client entertainment budgets, nothing individually alarming. Together, however, they painted a different picture. Claire noticed because she had become accustomed to comparing details rather than isolated events. One afternoon, she stopped by headquarters to deliver several documents Richard needed signed. As she waited outside Larry's office, laughter echoed through the partially open door. Larry was speaking with two senior executives. "By next year," he said confidently, "the company won't be run the old-fashioned way anymore." One executive asked carefully, "Have you discussed that with your father?" Larry leaned back in his chair. "He'll understand eventually." The second executive smiled uncertainly. "And the board? The board follows results." Larry grinned. "They'll have plenty of those." Claire quietly walked away before anyone noticed her standing there. She had no desire to become part of the conversation. That evening, she simply added another brief note to her journal. Larry referred to company direction as already decided. Nothing more, no opinion, no accusation, only a fact. December brought holiday celebrations throughout Bennett Holdings. Richard insisted the annual employee gathering continue despite his illness. He attended for only an hour. Employees welcomed him with genuine affection. Many embraced him. Others simply thanked him for years of steady leadership. Claire watched Richard spend nearly 10 minutes speaking with a maintenance supervisor whose wife had recently undergone surgery. He remembered every detail. Larry spent those same 10 minutes greeting television crews covering the company's charitable donations. Neither approach was necessarily wrong. Yet the contrast quietly lingered. Later that evening, while photographers captured Larry shaking hands with local officials, Richard sat beside Claire in a quieter corner of the ballroom. "Do you know what surprises me most?" Richard asked. Claire turned toward him. "What?" "I spent 40 years building this company." He watched employees laughing together across the room. "The buildings were the easy part." Claire waited. The difficult part was deciding every day what kind of people we wanted to become. His breathing slowed. "Most balance sheets never measure that." Claire nodded. "But history usually does." Richard smiled. "You always answer the question underneath the question." Christmas arrived with unusual tension inside the Bennett family. Larry insisted everyone gather at the estate, despite Richard's fragile condition. The evening appeared warm to outsiders. Elegant decorations, perfectly arranged tables, expensive wine, professional photographs. Everything looked exactly as magazines expected the Bennett family to appear. Reality was quieter. During dinner, Larry spoke almost exclusively about expansion opportunities. "We've identified 3 acquisition targets." Richard listened silently. Larry continued. We should move before competitors do. Richard calmly asked, have you reviewed their debt obligations? Our finance team handled that. Did you? Larry hesitated. I trust my people. Richard placed his fork down. So do I. A pause settled over the table. But trust isn't a substitute for responsibility. Larry forced a polite smile. I'll review everything. The conversation shifted. Claire noticed Richard barely touched his meal afterward. The first unmistakable crack appeared early the following year. Emily Carter, a senior accountant who had worked for Bennett Holdings for nearly 15 years, requested a confidential meeting with Richard. Daniel arranged the appointment. Because Richard tired easily, Claire organized the documents Emily planned to present. Emily arrived visibly nervous. I hope I'm overreacting, she admitted. Richard answered gently. I'd rather investigate a concern that proves harmless than ignore one that doesn't. Emily opened several folders. There are reimbursement requests. Richard adjusted his glasses. What about them? They've increased dramatically. Travel? Some. She hesitated. Others don't appear connected to company operations. Claire quietly organized the paperwork into chronological order. No one rushed Emily. She continued. Several expenses were approved directly through Mr. Larry Bennett's executive account. Richard remained calm. Were company policies followed? Emily looked down. Technically. She searched for the right words. The approvals exist, but the supporting documentation is incomplete. Richard nodded slowly. Thank you for bringing this forward. Emily looked relieved. I wasn't accusing anyone. I know. Richard closed the folder carefully. You were doing your job. After Emily left, silence filled the room. Claire did not immediately speak. Richard finally broke the quiet. What do you think? Claire answered carefully. I think incomplete documentation deserves complete review. Richard looked at her with quiet appreciation. You didn't assume guilt. There isn't enough information. And if there is later, then the evidence should speak louder than opinions. Richard leaned back. I wish more executives believed that. Over the next several weeks, Richard authorized a routine internal review. Officially, it was part of annual governance procedures. Unofficially, he wanted answers. Claire helped organize documents without directing the investigation. She insisted every record remain exactly where it belonged. Nothing removed, nothing hidden, nothing interpreted before verification. As reports accumulated, patterns slowly emerged. Luxury hotels, private dining expenses, jewelry purchases classified as executive gifts, weekend travel lacking business schedules. Each item alone could have been explained. Together, they demanded explanation. Claire noticed several names appearing repeatedly. One name appeared more often than the others. Vanessa Cole. The expense reports described her differently each time. Consultant, marketing advisor, external strategist, client liaison. Yet HR records contained no employee file. Vendor databases listed no consulting contract. Claire said nothing. She simply marked the references with small adhesive tabs before placing the folders inside Richard's review box. One rainy afternoon, Larry arrived unexpectedly at the estate. He entered Richard's study, carrying expensive whiskey. Thought we'd celebrate. Richard smiled faintly. What are we celebrating? The future. Larry poured 2 glasses without waiting for permission. I've been talking with several investors. Richard accepted neither the glass nor the invitation. What did you promise them? Larry laughed. Confidence. What specifically? They wanted reassurance that leadership won't change. Richard looked directly at his son. It will. Larry smiled. I know. Richard's expression remained unreadable. You may not understand how. Larry interpreted the comment as modest hesitation. Dad. He leaned forward. You've earned your retirement. I haven't announced retirement. You don't need to. Larry spread his hands confidently. Everyone already knows. Richard quietly studied his son. There was no anger in his face, only sadness. You should be careful, he said softly, about celebrating events that haven't happened. Larry chuckled. I've waited my entire life. Richard answered just as quietly. Then waiting a little longer shouldn't be difficult. Larry assumed the conversation had ended in harmless disagreement. He left the estate feeling even more certain that control of Bennett Holdings was only a matter of time. He never asked why his father had looked so disappointed after he drove away. Inside the study, Richard remained seated for several minutes. Claire entered to collect empty coffee cups. She immediately noticed the untouched glass of whiskey beside Richard's chair. You didn't drink it. Richard looked toward the rain falling beyond the window. No. After another long silence, he spoke almost in a whisper. The most dangerous kind of confidence. He stopped. Claire waited patiently. Is confidence that no longer believes it can be questioned. Claire followed his gaze toward the gray sky. Outside, the rain washed quietly over the stone pathways surrounding the Bennett estate. Inside, another document rested inside Margaret Sullivan's locked briefcase. It was an amendment Richard had already signed months earlier. No one outside a very small circle knew it existed. Not Larry, not the board, not even Claire herself. And before spring arrived, Larry would unknowingly provide Richard with one final reason never to change his mind. Winter loosened its grip slowly over Columbus, but Richard Bennett's health continued moving in only one direction. The treatments grew more demanding. Recovery took longer after each hospital visit. Even on his strongest days, walking from the library to the garden left him noticeably exhausted. Yet Richard insisted on maintaining one tradition. Every Monday morning, he reviewed Bennett Holdings' executive summaries personally. Daniel Brooks delivered the files before sunrise. Claire Evans Bennett organized them in chronological order, adding colored tabs wherever supporting documents were missing or financial explanations required clarification. Richard appreciated the system. It saves me hours. Claire smiled. It only saves time if someone still reads everything. Richard chuckled softly. I always will. She looked at him for a moment before answering. I know. Across town, Larry Bennett was becoming increasingly comfortable with authority that officially did not yet belong to him. Employees had begun noticing subtle changes. Larry requested that executive assistants copy him on nearly every board communication. He instructed department heads to present strategic plans directly to him before they reached Richard. He even started referring to the executive conference room as my boardroom. No one corrected him aloud. Some people admired confidence, others recognized impatience. Daniel noticed both. One afternoon, he delivered several contracts requiring Richard's signature. As he prepared to leave headquarters, he passed Larry's office. The door stood partially open. Inside, Larry was speaking with Vanessa Cole. Daniel had met her twice before. Larry had introduced her as an independent branding consultant. Yet Daniel had never seen a consulting agreement, nor had procurement approved any contract under her name. He slowed unintentionally when he heard Larry laugh. Just give it another month. Vanessa smiled. You sound certain. I am. And your father, Larry waved dismissively. He won't interfere much longer. Daniel continued walking. He neither interrupted nor announced his presence. By the time he reached the elevator, he had already decided not to repeat the conversation immediately. Not because it lacked importance, because Richard had always taught him that overheard remarks deserved confirmation before becoming accusations. Facts first, conclusions later. Meanwhile, Claire continued living as though nothing had changed. She still prepared breakfast every morning. She still visited Richard several afternoons each week. She still returned home each evening before Larry. Their conversations had become noticeably shorter, mostly practical. Will you be home for dinner? No. Do you need anything? No. There are documents on your desk. I'll look later. Sometimes he never did. Claire stopped expecting more, not because she had given up, because expectations once repeatedly ignored eventually transformed into acceptance. She did not complain to friends. She did not seek sympathy. Instead, she filled another page of her journal. Communication continues decreasing. Avoid assumptions. Observe patterns. In early March, Richard requested a private lunch with Margaret Sullivan. The meeting took place at the Bennett estate rather than the law office. Only Daniel knew the schedule. Claire prepared the dining room before quietly leaving them alone. The conversation lasted nearly 3 hours. Afterward, Margaret remained in Richard's study reviewing documents while Richard rested upstairs. Daniel entered carrying fresh coffee. Margaret removed her reading glasses. Thank you. Daniel placed the tray on the desk. I assume today's paperwork is important. Margaret looked toward the closed study door. It may become the most important work I've handled in 35 years. Daniel hesitated. Is there anything you need from me? There is. She slid a sealed envelope across the desk. If anything happens unexpectedly... Daniel immediately interrupted. Richard will recover. Margaret smiled gently. I hope so. She rested one hand on the envelope. But hope has never replaced preparation. Daniel nodded. Richard had said almost those exact words countless times. A week later, Bennett Holdings hosted its annual Executive Leadership Conference. Nearly 200 managers attended. Richard, following medical advice, participated only through a recorded welcome message. Larry delivered the keynote speech. He spoke confidently about innovation, expansion, global partnerships, future acquisitions. The audience applauded enthusiastically. Claire watched quietly from the back of the ballroom. During a networking reception afterward, she overheard several regional directors speaking. Larry already sounds like CEO. He practically is. I heard Richard barely comes into the office anymore. Someone else lowered his voice. Transition probably happens this year. Claire continued walking, without joining the conversation. She neither confirmed nor denied anything. Rumors often spread faster when someone tried stopping them. That evening, Larry returned home unusually energized. He poured himself a drink before Claire had finished removing her coat. The conference went perfectly. I'm glad it went well. You should have seen the investors. I'm sure they were impressed. Larry grinned. They already treat me like I'm in charge. Claire quietly placed her handbag on the table. Appearances can be persuasive. They're more than appearances. He lifted his glass. It's reality. Claire looked at him calmly. Has anything officially changed? Larry's smile faded slightly. It will. When? He shrugged. Soon. Claire offered no further questions. She simply excused herself and went upstairs. Larry interpreted her silence as indifference. In truth, Claire had begun recognizing a troubling pattern. Larry increasingly spoke about future events as though they had already happened. Only days later, another issue surfaced. Emily Carter requested a second confidential meeting. This time, she arrived carrying additional financial records. Richard, Daniel, Claire, and Margaret were all present. Emily carefully opened several folders. "I found more reimbursement requests." Richard nodded. "Related to the earlier review?" "Yes." Emily pointed toward highlighted entries. The spending accelerated. Margaret adjusted her glasses. "Explain." Emily organized the pages. There are luxury vacations listed as executive client development. Supporting documentation. Incomplete. She turned another page. High-value jewelry categorized as promotional appreciation. Daniel frowned. Recipients? Unknown. Another page. Private charter flights. Another. Weekend resort reservations. Another. Repeated payments authorized under Mr. Larry Bennett's executive approval. Richard remained perfectly still. Claire watched Emily rather than the documents. The accountant's hands trembled slightly. She was frightened. Not because of the paperwork, because exposing irregularities involving the founder's son required extraordinary courage. Richard noticed it too. He closed the folders. "Emily." She looked up. "You've protected this company for 15 years. I've only followed policy." "Exactly." He smiled warmly. "And today you're still following policy." Emily exhaled slowly. The tension in her shoulders eased. After she left, no one spoke for nearly a full minute. Finally, Margaret broke the silence. "These records justify a formal review." Richard nodded once. "Proceed." No anger, no raised voice. Only one word. Yet everyone in the room understood its significance. The matter had officially entered legal procedure. Claire spent the next several evenings organizing documentation requested by Margaret. Every email, every invoice, every bank statement, every approval trail. She never selected evidence. She simply arranged it. Objectivity mattered. Whenever duplicate records appeared, she noted them. Whenever information was missing, she labeled the gap instead of guessing. Daniel quietly admired her discipline. "You've never once said Larry is guilty." Claire continued sorting files. "I don't know everything." "But you suspect." "I suspect missing information." Daniel smiled faintly. Most people would fill in the blanks. Claire placed another folder into chronological order. That's how innocent people get blamed. And guilty people, they usually reveal themselves. Near the end of March, Richard experienced another serious medical emergency. This time, the ambulance arrived just after midnight. Claire rode beside him. Larry followed separately after finishing a corporate dinner nearly 45 minutes away. Doctors stabilized Richard before dawn. When Larry finally entered the intensive care unit waiting area, he looked exhausted. "How is he?" Claire answered honestly. "Stable." Larry rubbed his face. "I left as soon as I got the call." "I know." He sat heavily beside her. For several minutes, neither spoke. Then Larry quietly asked, "Did he say anything?" Claire thought carefully. "Only that Daniel should bring the blue folder from his study." Larry frowned. "What blue folder?" "I don't know." It was true. She had never opened it. She had only heard Richard mention it once before. Across the waiting room, Daniel had already received Richard's brief, handwritten note from a nurse. "Bring the blue folder." Nothing more. Daniel understood immediately which folder Richard meant. Locked inside it were documents that had remained untouched for months. Documents prepared with Margaret Sullivan. documents connected to decisions Richard had already finalized. As the first light of morning spread across the hospital windows, Larry stared silently toward the intensive care unit, believing he was waiting for his father's recovery. He had no idea that another countdown had already begun. Not toward Richard's death alone, but toward the reading of a will, whose most important secret had been waiting patiently hidden behind signatures, witnesses, and sealed legal envelopes, long before anyone imagined they would matter. Richard Bennett never returned to the Bennett estate. 3 days after being admitted to the intensive care unit, he passed away quietly before sunrise, with only the steady rhythm of medical equipment and the soft voices of nurses breaking the silence. Claire Evans Bennett was there. So was Daniel Brooks. Larry Bennett arrived less than 20 minutes later. He stood motionless outside the hospital room, staring through the glass as though refusing to accept what every monitor had already confirmed. For several long moments, no one spoke. Then Margaret Sullivan arrived. She had represented Richard Bennett for more than 3 decades, yet even she looked older walking through that hospital corridor. She stepped beside Larry. "I'm very sorry." Larry nodded without looking at her. "When?" "Just before 5. He closed his eyes. I thought I'd have one more conversation." Margaret answered gently. "I believe everyone hopes for one more." No one mentioned unfinished business. No one mentioned the company. No one mentioned inheritance. There would be time for those matters later. At least, that was how Claire believed the day should unfold. Larry, however, struggled to separate grief from expectation. The funeral took place 6 days later. Hundreds attended. Employees from every level of Bennett Holdings filled the church long before the service began. Former executives flew in from other states. Community leaders occupied the front rows. Several families whose children's medical treatments had been funded by Richard's charitable foundation quietly entered through a side entrance. Richard had never asked for publicity regarding his donations. Many people only learned about them after his death. Claire sat beside Larry throughout the ceremony. She noticed something that escaped nearly everyone else. People cried for Richard because they remembered being helped by him. Not because he had been wealthy. Not because he had built a successful corporation. Because at some point in their lives, Richard had made them feel seen. That was the legacy filling the church, not the balance sheet, not the stock price, the people. After the final hymn, guests slowly gathered outside, beneath gray spring skies. Reporters waited beyond the gates. Larry immediately found himself surrounded by microphones. "Mr. Bennett, what does your father's passing mean for the future of Bennett Holdings? Will leadership transition immediately? Do you expect to become chairman?" Larry paused just long enough to appear respectful. "My father spent his life preparing the next generation." He lowered his voice slightly. "I intend to honor everything he built." It sounded like the perfect answer. Television stations replayed the clip throughout the afternoon. Claire never criticized him. She simply noticed he had answered questions about succession before speaking publicly about the man he had just buried. That observation joined dozens of others already recorded in her journal. The following Monday, headquarters reopened. Employees returned quietly. Flowers still covered the reception desk. Richard's office remained closed. His nameplate stayed exactly where it had always been. Inside the executive suite, Larry called his first unofficial leadership meeting. Around the conference table sat several senior executives. Michael Reed, the company's chief financial officer. Emily Carter from accounting. The vice president of operations. The human resources director. Daniel Brooks. Larry entered carrying a folder beneath his arm. He did not sit in his usual chair. Instead, he walked directly to Richard's seat at the head of the table. No one commented. He rested both hands on the polished wood. "We have a responsibility to maintain stability." Heads nodded around the room. "Our employees need confidence." More nods. "Our investors need certainty." Again, agreement. Larry smiled. "So we'll move forward exactly as planned." Michael Reed cleared his throat carefully. "Should we wait until after the will is read?" Larry dismissed the concern with a wave of his hand. "My father's intentions have never been a mystery." Silence settled over the room. Daniel looked toward the empty chair beside the window where Richard usually sat during meetings. Larry continued. "The board already understands continuity is essential." Emily lowered her eyes toward her notes. Michael chose his words cautiously. "There are still legal procedures." Larry smiled confidently. "Formalities." No one challenged him. Not because everyone agreed, because no one believed that conference room was the proper place. Claire, who had attended only to deliver several compliance documents requested by Margaret Sullivan, remained near the doorway throughout the discussion. She said nothing. She wasn't a board member. She wasn't part of executive leadership. Her opinion had not been requested. Larry barely acknowledged her presence. As the meeting concluded, he turned toward her. "You probably won't need to come to headquarters much after next week." Claire met his eyes calmly. "If legal matters require me, I'll come." He smiled. "I don't think they'll require very much." She simply nodded. "We'll see." Those two words lingered in Daniel's mind long after everyone left. Not because they sounded defiant, because Claire had spoken them without the slightest trace of emotion. Over the next several days, Larry behaved less like an heir waiting for legal confirmation and more like an executive already exercising complete authority. He instructed facilities to begin renovating Richard's office. He approved preliminary designs for a more modern executive suite. He scheduled meetings with investment analysts to discuss the company's next chapter. He even asked human resources to prepare organizational charts reflecting future leadership changes. Every request contained one unspoken assumption. The future had already been decided. Daniel quietly delayed several orders by explaining that legal review remained necessary. Larry grew impatient. "Daniel." "Yes." "We can't pause everything." "I'm not suggesting we pause." "Then why the delays?" Daniel answered honestly. "Certain decisions require official authorization." Larry leaned back. "They'll have it." Daniel remained respectful. "They don't yet." Larry looked away, clearly irritated. For the first time in 25 years of working together, Daniel sensed the same frustration Richard had quietly carried during their final months. At home, the atmosphere between Larry and Claire became increasingly distant. They occupied the same house, rarely the same conversations. One evening, Larry entered the dining room carrying 2 glasses of wine. "We should talk." Claire closed the folder she had been reading. "About what?" "The future." She waited. Larry sat across from her. "I've been thinking." "So have I." He smiled as though delivering generous news. "When everything settles, I'll make sure you're comfortable." Claire looked at him quietly. "What does that mean?" "You won't have to worry financially." She continued watching him. "I appreciate the concern." "I'm serious." He leaned forward. "I know this hasn't been the marriage either of us expected." Claire said nothing. But once the estate is finalized, he hesitated. "We can move on respectfully." There it was. Not anger, not accusation, simply assumption. He assumed the inheritance would belong to him. He assumed the marriage would end on his timetable. He assumed Claire would quietly accept whatever arrangement he considered fair. Claire folded her hands together. Has the will been read? No. So nothing has been finalized. Larry laughed lightly. We both know how this works. Claire answered with remarkable calm. I've learned that legal documents usually matter more than assumptions. Larry smiled. They won't surprise me. She looked at him for several silent seconds. I hope you're right. He interpreted the sentence as agreement. She intended it as caution. 2 days later, Margaret Sullivan sent formal notices. The reading of Richard Bennett's will would take place Friday morning at 10 o'clock. Attendance was limited. Larry Bennett, Claire Evans Bennett, Daniel Brooks, Michael Reed, several board representatives, and 2 witnesses required under state law. The notices were brief, professional, nothing unusual. Larry glanced over the letter before placing it on the kitchen counter. By tomorrow afternoon, he said confidently, this whole process will finally be over. Claire picked up her own envelope. She read every line twice, not because she expected surprises, because habits built over decades did not disappear simply because life became difficult. Across town, Margaret carefully removed a thick sealed envelope from a fireproof vault. Across its front in Richard Bennett's unmistakable handwriting were 8 words, to be opened only during the formal reading. She placed the envelope inside her briefcase before locking it again. For the first time in many years, even Margaret felt the weight of what tomorrow would bring. She knew exactly what Richard had decided. She also knew no one else in that room, not even Claire Evans Bennett herself, had the slightest idea how dramatically one name inside that sealed document would change every assumption Larry Bennett had spent months celebrating. Friday morning arrived beneath a sky of low gray clouds, the kind that seemed unable to decide whether to rain or simply remain heavy. By 9:30, the conference room at Sullivan and Hale Attorneys had already been prepared. The room was intentionally simple. A polished walnut table, leather chairs, a recording system required for estate documentation, pitchers of water, stacks of legal folders placed with careful precision. No flowers, no decorations. Richard Bennett had specifically requested that the reading of his will be treated as a legal proceeding rather than a family ceremony. Margaret Sullivan approved of that decision. Grief belonged to the funeral. Today belonged to the law. Daniel Brooks arrived first. That did not surprise Margaret. During 25 years of working together, Daniel had never once been late for an important meeting. He quietly greeted the receptionist before taking the chair nearest the window, neither nervous nor relaxed, simply waiting. A few minutes later, Michael Reed entered carrying a leather portfolio. The company's chief financial officer had barely slept during the previous week. Too many financial responsibilities had accumulated since Richard's death. He shook Daniel's hand. Long week, Daniel nodded. The longest I can remember. Neither man attempted small talk afterward. Claire Evans Bennett arrived exactly 8 minutes before 10. She wore a navy blue suit with no jewelry except her wedding ring and a simple silver watch. Her appearance reflected neither mourning nor celebration. Only professionalism. Margaret noticed Claire carrying a familiar black notebook, not the leather journal she kept privately at home. A smaller notebook reserved for meetings. Claire greeted everyone quietly before choosing a seat midway down the table rather than near the head. She had no interest in symbolic positions. She simply selected the nearest available chair. Daniel watched her organize a pen beside the notebook. Everything deliberate, everything calm. He wondered whether she had slept any better than Michael. Judging by her expression, there was no way to know. Larry Bennett arrived precisely at 10. Not early, not late, exactly on time. His charcoal suit had been tailored only weeks earlier. His tie carried the subtle Bennett family crest Richard had worn for years. Several people noticed the detail. Larry entered, smiling politely. "Good morning." He shook hands confidently around the room. When he reached Claire, he paused. "You look serious." She answered simply, "This is a serious day." He smiled. "It won't be difficult." Claire made no reply. Larry took the chair at the head of the table, Richard's chair. No one commented. Margaret merely observed the choice before taking her own seat opposite him. She waited until the clock reached 10. Then she opened the first folder. "Thank you all for coming." Her voice carried the calm authority of someone who had spent decades inside courtrooms. "As attorney for the late Richard Bennett, today's responsibility is to formally read and execute the last will and testament, along with all legally recognized amendments." She looked around the room. "This meeting is being recorded." She pressed a button. A small red light illuminated. "The purpose of this proceeding is accuracy, not debate." Larry nodded confidently. "Understood," Margaret continued. "If questions arise, they will be addressed after each section has been completed." Again, Larry nodded. Everything appeared routine, exactly as he expected. Margaret began reading. The opening paragraphs reflected Richard's personal statement. His gratitude toward employees, his appreciation for lifelong friends, his hope that Bennett Holdings would continue serving communities with integrity. Claire listened carefully. Daniel lowered his eyes. Michael folded his hands together. Even Larry appeared respectful. For several minutes, no one interrupted. Then came the first distribution of assets. Richard's charitable foundation would receive additional funding. Larry smiled faintly. He had expected that. Several longtime employees would receive financial gifts recognizing decades of service. Again, Larry remained relaxed. Richard had always rewarded loyalty. The Bennett Estate's historic lake house would be donated to an environmental conservation trust. Larry barely reacted. He had never liked spending weekends there anyway. The primary residence would remain inside the family trust. Nothing surprising. Several investment accounts would establish scholarships for first-generation college students. Larry glanced briefly toward the window. Still predictable. Margaret continued reading without changing her tone. Every paragraph reflected careful planning. Every clause had been professionally drafted. Every signature had been properly witnessed, exactly as Richard preferred. Nearly 40 minutes passed. The atmosphere remained calm. Larry grew increasingly comfortable. He occasionally leaned back in his chair, almost relaxed. When Michael requested clarification regarding one charitable endowment, Margaret answered patiently before continuing. Daniel noticed something. The thick, sealed envelope Richard had instructed Margaret to protect still remained unopened beside her briefcase. She had not touched it. Not once. Daniel remembered the handwriting across the front, to be opened only during the formal reading. Apparently, that moment had not yet arrived. Margaret turned another page. We will now address corporate ownership. Larry straightened almost immediately. For the first time that morning, genuine anticipation appeared in his face. Claire quietly uncapped her pen. Michael adjusted his glasses. Daniel folded his hands together. Margaret continued. My shares in Bennett Holdings shall remain under the Bennett Family Trust. Larry nodded confidently. Subject to the governance provisions outlined within the trust agreement. Still expected. Income distributions shall continue according to existing trust regulations. Nothing unusual. Larry relaxed again. He whispered almost playfully toward Claire. "I told you." Claire did not answer. She continued taking notes. Margaret proceeded. "The chairman of Bennett Holdings shall be appointed according to the board governance charter and not by inheritance." Larry barely reacted. He had expected the board to elect him regardless. His confidence remained intact. After all, everyone considered him Richard's obvious successor. Another 20 minutes passed. Routine legal language, tax provisions, administrative instructions, insurance allocations. Nothing remotely dramatic. Larry's confidence continued growing. He checked his watch twice. At one point, he even smiled toward Michael Reed. Michael politely returned the smile without enthusiasm. Claire noticed Larry beginning to gather his papers, almost as though he believed the meeting had effectively ended. Margaret, however, quietly closed the current folder instead of announcing completion. She removed her glasses. The room fell unusually silent. Then she looked directly at everyone seated around the table. "There remains one final amendment." Larry smiled. "I assume there might be." Margaret nodded. This amendment was executed approximately 18 months before Richard Bennett's death. Larry appeared unconcerned. "Very well." Margaret reached toward the sealed envelope resting beside her briefcase. Daniel immediately recognized it. So did Michael. Neither man moved. Margaret carefully examined the intact wax seal. Still unbroken. She held it up for both witnesses. The seal remains undisturbed. Each witness confirmed verbally for the recording. Margaret then broke the seal slowly with a letter opener. The quiet tearing sound seemed unusually loud inside the conference room. Larry watched with mild curiosity. Nothing more. He expected another charitable gift, perhaps revised tax instructions, maybe additional donations. Certainly nothing affecting him. Inside the envelope rested several documents, thicker than expected. Margaret reviewed the first page silently before looking toward the recording device. She spoke with deliberate clarity. This amendment establishes additional conditions governing administration of the Bennett Family Trust and all remaining estate assets. Larry leaned back comfortably. "Go ahead," Margaret continued reading. "In order to preserve the integrity of estate administration." She paused only long enough to ensure every word was recorded accurately. "While all assets remaining within the Bennett Family Trust shall undergo mandatory legal verification, financial review, and compliance examination before any beneficiary receives final distribution." Larry frowned slightly. "What does that mean?" Margaret looked up. "I'll explain after completing the paragraph." Larry nodded impatiently. She resumed. "The authority to supervise authorized delay when legally necessary and certify completion of this review shall belong exclusively to the individual appointed by me as executor of my estate." The room became noticeably quieter. Michael glanced briefly toward Daniel. Daniel remained perfectly still. Larry smiled again. "Reasonable." He folded his arms. "I'm assuming that's you." Margaret calmly shook her head. "No." Larry looked mildly surprised. "Then Daniel," Daniel quietly answered. "No." Larry laughed softly. "Well?" He looked around the table. "Whoever it is, let's hope they don't waste everyone's time." Margaret lowered her eyes to the final page. Only she knew that the next sentence would erase every assumption Larry Bennett had carried into the room that morning. The name Richard had written 18 months earlier had remained hidden through months of illness, through the funeral, through endless speculation about succession. It had survived because Richard understood something his son never did. Power inherited by birth could be dangerous. Authority earned through trust was something entirely different. Margaret inhaled once. before preparing to read the line that would change every relationship inside that room forever. No one in the conference room moved. The silence that followed Margaret Sullivan's last sentence was not uncomfortable. It was expectant. Larry Bennett remained relaxed, one arm resting across the back of his chair. He had already dismissed the identity of the executor as a technicality. Whether Richard had selected Margaret Daniel Brooks or another trusted professional hardly seemed important. In Larry's mind, an executor merely carried out instructions. The inheritance itself, he believed, had already been decided. Margaret looked once more at the final page inside the sealed amendment. She adjusted the document so the recording system would clearly capture every word. Then she spoke. Pursuant to this amendment executed on September 14th, 18 months prior to my passing. She paused only long enough to confirm the page number. I hereby appoint my daughter-in-law, Claire Evans Bennett, as the sole executor of my estate. For a brief moment, the room forgot how to breathe. No one spoke, no one shifted in a chair. Even the air conditioning seemed unusually loud. Larry stared at Margaret as though he had misheard a foreign language. His smile remained on his face for nearly 3 seconds after the words ended. Then it slowly disappeared. What? Margaret calmly repeated the sentence. The sole executor appointed by Richard Bennett is Claire Evans Bennett. Larry laughed. Not naturally. It was the uncertain laugh people used when reality failed to match expectation. That's impossible. Margaret said nothing. Larry looked toward Daniel. Tell her. Daniel remained still. The document says what it says. Larry turned toward Michael Reed. This has to be some mistake. Michael lowered his eyes. I've never seen the amendment. Larry looked around the table again. Someone surely would explain the misunderstanding. No one did. Margaret opened another folder. Before today's meeting, the original amendment was verified through probate records, witness affidavits, and notarial certification. She slid several certified copies across the table. The execution complied with every legal requirement. Larry grabbed the documents. His eyes moved rapidly across the pages. Richard Bennett's signature, Margaret's signature, 2 witnesses, official seals, dates, registration numbers. Every page appeared genuine. His voice became sharper. This could have been changed. Margaret answered immediately. No. Forged? No. Backdated? No. Each response arrived without hesitation. Larry placed both hands on the table. My father would never appoint Claire over his own son. Margaret folded her hands calmly. Your father appointed an executor. She emphasized the final word. He did not appoint an heir. Larry frowned. What's the difference? Margaret met his eyes. A beneficiary receives assets. She paused. An executor protects the legal process that determines how those assets are distributed. Larry shook his head. Why Claire? I'll continue reading Richard's written explanation. Margaret lifted another page. This statement accompanies my appointment. She began reading Richard's own words. If this document is being read, I'm no longer able to explain my decision personally. The room grew quieter. I have chosen Claire Evans Bennett because she has repeatedly demonstrated patience, where others preferred speed. Larry's jaw tightened. Accuracy, where others accepted assumptions. Claire lowered her eyes. And responsibility, without asking for recognition. Daniel slowly closed his notebook. He remembered Richard speaking those exact qualities months earlier. Margaret continued. The role of executor is not a reward. It is a burden. It requires someone capable of following evidence even when emotion encourages shortcuts. Larry interrupted. This is ridiculous. Margaret looked toward him. Please allow me to finish. He leaned back heavily. She continued reading. My decision should not be interpreted as lack of love toward my son. Claire looked briefly toward Larry. His face had become rigid. It should be understood as recognition that different responsibilities require different strengths. Margaret lowered the page. Richard's explanation had ended. Silence returned. Larry suddenly stood. I object. Margaret answered calmly. This is not a courtroom. I don't care. His voice rose. My father wasn't thinking clearly. Margaret remained composed. His physicians certified legal competency. He was sick. His attending physician, neurologist, and independent evaluator each confirmed full testamentary capacity. Larry looked toward Claire. You knew. Claire finally raised her eyes. No. Don't lie. I learned my name at exactly the same moment you did. Larry searched her expression. There was no triumph, no satisfaction, only surprise carefully controlled beneath years of discipline. In truth, Claire's heartbeat had not fully slowed since hearing Margaret read Richard's words. She had never expected this. Not once. Richard had trusted her with countless conversations. Never this secret. Margaret reached into another folder. There is additional guidance concerning the executor's authority. Larry laughed bitterly. Of course there is. She ignored the interruption. The executor shall possess full legal authority to review all financial records, trust assets, corporate transactions, affecting estate value, outstanding liabilities, pending contractual obligations, and any transfers completed within 24 months preceding my death. Michael Reed immediately looked toward Margaret. 24 months. Correct. Daniel understood the implication instantly. Every significant financial decision during Richard's illness now became subject to review. Larry recognized it a second later. His confidence visibly faltered. Wait, he leaned forward. Claire gets access to everything, Margaret answered. Everything relevant to estate administration. Larry's voice hardened. My business records, if they affect estate assets. My executive accounts, if funded by estate-owned entities. My approvals, if legally reviewable. Larry turned toward Claire again. You can't possibly understand corporate finance. Claire answered quietly. I understand documentation. The simplicity of the sentence unsettled him more than any argument could have. Margaret continued reading. The executor shall delay distribution whenever necessary to ensure complete legal compliance. Larry interrupted again. Delay? Yes. For how long? As long as reasonably required? Larry looked incredulous. So she controls when I receive anything, Margaret corrected him. No. She controls completion of the legal review. The law controls distribution. Larry shook his head. That's the same thing. It is not. Margaret's voice remained measured. If documentation is complete distribution proceeds, if documentation requires investigation, the executor has a legal duty to investigate. Claire listened carefully. The word duty echoed more strongly than authority. Richard had never entrusted her with power for its own sake. He had entrusted responsibility. Those were not the same thing. Michael Reed finally spoke. Margaret? She looked toward him. If Claire declines the appointment, Margaret answered immediately. The court appoints an alternate executor identified in sealed succession instructions. Daniel looked surprised. There was an alternate. Yes. Larry almost smiled. Good. Margaret finished the sentence. The alternate serves only if Claire is unable or unwilling. She turned toward Claire. "The appointment is yours to accept or decline." Every eye in the room shifted toward Claire. She had not prepared for this moment. Not emotionally, not practically. She thought about Richard sitting quietly in the sunroom, reviewing documents. She remembered hospital waiting rooms, medication schedules, conversations about honesty, his habit of thanking receptionists by name, his belief that facts should never become comfortable. She also thought about Larry, her husband, the man who had spent months treating the inheritance as inevitable. If she accepted every financial record connected to the estate, would eventually cross her desk, including his. Margaret spoke gently. "You may take time." Claire shook her head slightly. "No." Everyone waited. Claire folded her hands together before answering. "If Mr. Bennett believed I was capable of carrying this responsibility," she paused, "then I will honor his decision." Not one word more. No dramatic speech, no declaration. Only acceptance. Margaret nodded once. "For the record, Claire Evans Bennett has accepted appointment as executor." The recording device quietly captured every syllable. Larry sat perfectly still. His expression had changed completely. This was no longer disbelief. It was calculation. He began mentally reviewing the previous 2 years, expense reports, corporate approvals, transfers, conversations, travel. He suddenly remembered Emily Carter's questions, Michael's hesitation, Daniel's delays, Margaret's insistence on procedure. Pieces that had once seemed unrelated now began fitting together in unsettling ways. He looked toward Claire. She was already reading the appointment documents carefully before signing anything. Exactly as she always had. Every paragraph, every clause, every signature line. Larry had once mocked that habit. Now he watched it with growing unease. Because for the first time, he realized something Richard Bennett had understood long before anyone else. Claire Evans Bennett did not rush. She verified. And beginning today, every decision Larry had made during Richard's final 2 years would be examined by the one person he had spent months underestimating. The inheritance he believed was only days away had suddenly become something very different. It had become a legal process, and Claire now held the responsibility to determine when that process was truly complete. The meeting ended without anyone raising another objection. Margaret Sullivan collected the signed acceptance forms with the same care she had shown throughout the reading. Every signature was verified. Every page was dated. Every recording was archived. Nothing about Richard Bennett's estate would rely on memory when documentation existed. Claire Evans Bennett appreciated that. She had always believed that procedures protected everyone equally, not just the innocent, not just the accused. Everyone. Outside the law office, reporters waited behind temporary barriers. News had already spread that Richard Bennett's will had been read. Camera crews hoped to capture emotional reactions. Larry Bennett walked through the front doors first. Questions came immediately. "Mr. Bennett, has the estate been settled? When will Bennett Holdings announce new leadership? Did everything go according to plan?" Larry forced a practiced smile. "The legal process is continuing. Can you comment on today's decisions? There will be an appropriate time. Are you satisfied with the outcome?" His smile hesitated for only a fraction of a second. "My father's wishes deserve respect." It sounded measured, professional. Few people watching the evening news would notice how tightly he gripped the folder beneath his arm. Claire exited several moments later through a separate entrance with Margaret and Daniel. She declined every interview. No comment, that was all she said. Not because she wished to hide anything, because the legal process had only begun. Speaking publicly served no useful purpose. By Monday morning, Claire's temporary office had been prepared inside Sullivan and Hale. Margaret believed separating estate administration from Bennett Holdings would eliminate unnecessary pressure. Claire agreed immediately. The room was modest. One desk, 2 filing cabinets, a secure computer connected to probate records, shelves already filled with empty binders waiting to receive evidence. Margaret handed Claire a thick folder. "Your appointment order." Claire accepted it. "Thank you. You now have authority to request any document relevant to the estate." Claire nodded. "I understand." Margaret studied her carefully. "I want to ask you something." Claire waited. "Are you frightened?" Claire considered the question honestly. "A little." Margaret smiled. "Good." Claire looked surprised. "I expected you to say confidence was better." "No," Margaret folded her hands. "People who aren't slightly frightened by responsibility usually misunderstand it." Claire quietly absorbed the thought. Richard would have appreciated that answer. The first official task appeared deceptively simple. Create a complete inventory of estate assets. Margaret explained the legal requirement. No distributions until the inventory is verified. Claire reviewed the checklist. Real estate, investment portfolios, trust accounts, corporate shares, insurance policies, personal property, outstanding debts, pending litigation. Every category required independent confirmation. Claire immediately began organizing the work into chronological phases. Daniel noticed the familiar method. "You're making a schedule." "I'm preventing confusion." "You've done this before." "Not at this scale." She smiled faintly, but large problems usually become manageable after they're divided into smaller ones. Daniel nodded. Richard had often said something remarkably similar. Michael Reed arrived that afternoon carrying several encrypted hard drives. "The financial archive." Claire signed the evidence receipt before accepting them. Michael seemed relieved. "I appreciate that." Claire looked up. "The receipt. The procedure." He hesitated. "Some people would have simply taken the drives." Claire placed them inside a locked cabinet. "If records matter." She closed the cabinet. "Custody matters too." Michael smiled quietly. Richard truly had chosen carefully. The following morning, Emily Carter joined them. She carried 6 storage boxes filled with accounting files. "I brought everything connected to executive reimbursements." Claire looked at the stack. "Everything," Emily nodded. "Every file I could locate." Claire immediately corrected her. "Not every file." Emily looked confused. "What do you mean?" Claire opened the inventory checklist. "These boxes represent what you found." She wrote a note. "We still need confirmation that nothing else exists." Emily slowly smiled. "You really don't assume anything." Claire returned the smile. "It keeps mistakes from becoming facts." By Wednesday, the review officially began. Claire divided the documentation into categories: routine operating expenses, capital investments, executive reimbursements, personal benefit expenditures, trust-related transactions. No conclusions, only organization. Daniel watched from across the room. Hours passed without unnecessary conversation. The silence felt strangely productive. Near noon, Claire stopped at one reimbursement file. She compared 3 documents: expense approval, credit card statement, supporting invoice. Something did not align. She quietly marked the folder with a yellow tab. Daniel noticed. "Problem?" Difference. What kind? The hotel invoice lists one date. The reimbursement lists another. Clerical error. Possibly. She placed the folder aside. We'll verify before assuming. Yellow, not red. Yellow meant unresolved. Nothing more. The number of yellow tabs slowly increased. Restaurant receipts, travel authorizations, vehicle expenses, conference registrations. Most discrepancies remained small, individually insignificant. Collectively concerning, Claire requested additional records. Michael supplied corporate banking statements. Emily produced accounting ledgers. Daniel retrieved archived approval emails. Each new document either answered a question or created another. No one rushed the process. Richard had specifically instructed otherwise. Late Thursday afternoon, Michael entered Claire's office carrying another folder. I found something. Claire looked up. What is it? Executive account transfers. She accepted the file. The amounts aren't unusually large. Then why are they separated? Michael pointed toward several entries. They bypassed normal monthly reporting. Claire reviewed the pages. Every transfer carried Larry Bennett's executive authorization. Destination accounts appeared legitimate. Descriptions appeared routine. Yet one column caught her attention, supporting documentation. Several entries contained identical wording, filed separately. Claire frowned slightly. Separately where? Michael shook his head. I couldn't find those files. Claire looked toward Daniel. Archive request. Daniel immediately made a note. I'll contact records. Still no accusations. Only another question requiring an answer. That evening, after everyone left, Claire remained alone, reviewing email archives. Thousands of messages, most entirely ordinary. Meeting invitations, budget updates, vendor confirmations. At nearly 8 o'clock, she opened one approval chain involving executive travel. Larry had requested reimbursement for what appeared to be a client development conference. Attached itinerary, hotel reservation, transportation receipts. Everything seemed complete. Until Claire compared the travel dates with another calendar. The conference had ended on Saturday. The hotel charges continued through Monday. She searched the corresponding meeting schedule. No business appointments appeared after Saturday afternoon. Another yellow tab. Nothing else. Friday morning brought an unexpected visitor. Vanessa Cole. The receptionist informed Claire that a woman wished to speak with estate administration. Claire invited her inside. Vanessa entered wearing expensive designer clothing and visible confidence. I understand you're handling Richard Bennett's estate. I am. Vanessa smiled politely. I'm here because Larry asked whether certain consulting agreements might require clarification. Claire opened a notebook. Which consulting agreements? Vanessa hesitated. The branding work. Claire waited. Could you identify the contract number? Vanessa blinked. I don't remember. The project title? I'm not sure. The invoice dates? Silence. Claire closed the notebook gently. If you provide the documentation, we'll review it. Vanessa forced another smile. I'll ask Larry. Thank you. The meeting lasted less than 4 minutes. After Vanessa left, Daniel quietly entered. You recognized her? Claire nodded. Yes. What did she want? Documentation. Did she bring any? No. Daniel looked toward the closed door. Claire simply wrote another note. Visitor referenced consulting work. No supporting records presented. Request additional documentation if submitted. Facts. Only facts. That afternoon, the requested archive boxes finally arrived. Daniel placed them carefully across the conference table. These were stored separately. Claire compared inventory numbers. One sequence immediately stood out. Several reimbursement files previously marked as filed separately had indeed been isolated from the main accounting archive. Not missing, separated. She opened the first folder. Inside lay original bank transfer confirmations, rather than copied summaries. Michael leaned closer. The originals. Claire nodded slowly. Original banking records contained far more detail. Routing numbers, receiving institutions, authorization timestamps, verification codes, information rarely visible on routine accounting reports. Claire reviewed the first transfer. Corporate account, approved by Larry Bennett. Destination. She stopped reading. Not because the transfer itself looked illegal, because the receiving account name did not match the description attached to the reimbursement. She compared the second transfer. The same pattern. Third, again. Fourth, again. Michael quietly whispered, "That's not right." Claire did not answer immediately. Instead, she opened another folder and compared every routing number. The same destination account appeared repeatedly under different expense descriptions. She reached for the secure telephone. "Margaret?" "Yes. I believe we've identified financial records requiring formal forensic review." Margaret's voice remained calm. "How confident are you?" Claire looked once more at the original banking documents, confident enough to ask questions, not confident enough to reach conclusions. "There are inconsistencies between reimbursement descriptions and bank destinations." A brief silence followed. Then Margaret answered, "Don't speculate." "I won't. I'm coming to the office." Claire carefully closed every folder before locking them inside the evidence cabinet. For the first time since accepting Richard's appointment, the review had crossed an invisible line. Until now, she'd been organizing records. Beginning today, the records themselves were starting to tell a story. Whether that story reflected innocent accounting mistakes or something far more serious remained unknown. But Richard Bennett had understood one truth when he appointed Claire Evans Bennett as executor. She would never accuse someone because a pattern looked suspicious. She would continue asking questions until the evidence no longer needed anyone's opinion to explain it. Margaret Sullivan arrived less than 30 minutes after Claire's phone call. She entered the temporary estate office carrying only a legal pad and a slim leather briefcase. Yet her presence immediately changed the atmosphere inside the room. The conversation was no longer merely administrative. It had become legal. Claire Evans Bennett had already arranged every document across the conference table in chronological order. No folders overlapped. No pages remained loose. Each potential discrepancy carried a numbered evidence marker instead of handwritten conclusions. Margaret noticed the system immediately. "You haven't labeled anything as misconduct." Claire looked up. "Because I don't know whether it is." Margaret nodded with quiet approval. "What do you know?" Claire slid the first file across the table. "I know the reimbursement descriptions do not consistently match the receiving accounts." The second, the original banking records contain routing information omitted from the accounting summaries. The third, Claire pointed toward another stack. The same destination account appears repeatedly under different expense categories. Margaret remained silent for several moments. Finally, she spoke. "Good." Daniel Brooks looked surprised. "Good," Margaret answered without taking her eyes off the documents. "You've identified facts." She tapped the evidence markers, not accusations. "That's exactly where an investigation should begin." Michael Reed joined them carrying another encrypted drive. "I requested archived banking confirmations from our primary financial institution. Margaret looked toward him. How complete are they? As complete as the bank maintains. Claire immediately signed another chain of custody receipt before accepting the drive. Michael smiled faintly. You really document everything. Claire inserted the drive into the secure workstation. If this ever reaches court, she continued typing, every question about evidence handling should already have an answer. Margaret quietly exchanged a glance with Daniel. Richard had made the correct choice. Not because Claire was brilliant, because she was disciplined. There was a difference. The additional banking records required almost 2 full days to organize. Thousands of transactions, corporate operating accounts, investment transfers, vendor payments, payroll distributions. Most proved entirely routine, exactly as expected. Claire intentionally avoided focusing only on suspicious entries. Confirmation bias had destroyed more investigations than missing paperwork ever had. She reviewed ordinary transactions with the same attention she gave unusual ones. Patterns mattered. Exceptions mattered. Everything mattered. Late Wednesday afternoon, she stopped typing. Michael. He looked up from another workstation. Yes. Can you come here? He walked over quietly. Claire pointed toward 2 computer screens displayed side by side. Read these descriptions. Michael leaned closer. Executive Client Relations. He looked at the second screen. Strategic Partnership Development. Claire clicked another window. Now compare the bank destination. Michael frowned. The same account. Claire nodded once. Different descriptions. Same recipient. Daniel joined them. How many? Claire opened a spreadsheet. 9 confirmed. Only 9, so far. She continued scrolling. 43 additional transfers still require verification. The room fell silent. No one rushed to conclusions. The numbers alone meant nothing until fully understood. That evening, Margaret contacted the probate court. By the following morning, formal authorization had been granted for a forensic accounting review. An independent accounting specialist would assist the estate. His name was Thomas Gallagher. Thomas arrived Friday morning carrying decades of experience investigating complex financial disputes. He greeted everyone politely before examining Claire's evidence index. After several minutes, he looked up. Who organized this? I did, Claire answered. Thomas slowly nodded. I've testified in more than 60 estate cases. He turned another page. I've never received documentation prepared quite like this. Claire appeared slightly uncomfortable. I simply arranged it logically. Thomas smiled. Logical saves months. He tapped the index. You separated verified facts from unanswered questions. Yes? Most people don't. They should. Thomas laughed softly. I agree. For the next several hours, Thomas independently reviewed the files. Claire intentionally avoided explaining her opinions. She answered only factual questions. Where did this document originate? Corporate Accounting Archive. Chain of custody. She handed him the receipt. Bank confirmation. Another folder. Email source archived server copy. Everything had documentation. Everything. Late that afternoon, Thomas finally leaned back. I can confirm one conclusion. Everyone looked toward him. The reimbursement descriptions do not consistently reflect the actual payment destinations. Larry's name had not been mentioned. Not once. Margaret appreciated that. Thomas continued. Whether that represents administrative error or intentional misclassification requires additional investigation. Claire quietly wrote those exact words into the case log. Administrative error or intentional misclassification. Nothing more, nothing less. Monday morning brought the next stage. Email archives. Richard had insisted every executive email remain securely backed up for compliance purposes. Daniel obtained access authorization. Claire created search categories: executive reimbursements, consulting agreements, travel approvals, vendor authorizations. The volume proved overwhelming. More than 40,000 messages. Thomas looked at the total. "This could take weeks," Claire answered calmly. "Then we'll take weeks." No one complained. Richard's instructions had never emphasized speed, only accuracy. By the third day, patterns slowly emerged. Most correspondence reflected ordinary business: budgets, contracts, meetings. Then, Claire opened an email chain connected to one of the question transfers. The subject line read, "Executive Strategy Session. Attached itinerary, luxury hotel, conference agenda." Everything appeared legitimate, until she noticed one missing detail: participant list. She searched the conference registration. Larry Bennett appeared. No additional Bennett Holdings employees attended. She searched expense approvals. 3 executive meals had been reimbursed. Only 1 company representative had registered. Thomas examined the records. "Possible explanation," Claire answered immediately. "Unknown." Michael suggested, "Perhaps clients attended." Claire nodded. "Possible." Thomas smiled. "I like that answer." "You expected another." "I expected assumptions." Claire returned to reviewing documents. "I prefer evidence." Another discovery arrived unexpectedly. Daniel entered, carrying a sealed archive box recently located in off-site storage. "I almost missed this." Claire examined the inventory label. Executive correspondence. Physical copies. Years earlier, Richard had insisted that certain sensitive communications be printed and archived separately from digital backups. Claire carefully opened the box. Inside lay neatly organized folders. Among them appeared several communications between Larry and various outside consultants. Most contained ordinary business discussions. One folder, however, contained something different. No contract, no invoice, only repeated references to someone identified simply as VC. Thomas looked toward Claire. "Initials?" She nodded. "Possibly." Daniel frowned. "Vanessa Cole," Claire immediately answered. "We don't know." She placed a yellow marker on the folder. Unidentified initials. Verification required. Again, no assumptions. The following afternoon, Emily Carter rushed into the office carrying another accounting ledger. "I found it." Claire stood. "What?" "The adjustment journal." Emily opened the ledger. When reimbursements were modified after submission, she pointed toward several entries. The original descriptions remained here. Thomas leaned over the pages. "And the revised versions." Emily turned another page. "Here." Claire compared both columns. The room became very quiet. Original description. Personal travel reimbursement pending review. Revised description, executive partnership development. Original luxury retail purchase. Revised client appreciation expense. Original weekend accommodation. Revised business continuity planning. Thomas slowly removed his glasses. Who authorized the revisions? Emily pointed toward the approval column. Single electronic authorization. Larry Bennett. No one spoke. Not because the evidence proved fraud, because it proved something undeniable. The descriptions had changed. Why they changed remained unanswered. But the changes themselves were now documented. Claire looked toward Margaret. Margaret quietly nodded. This becomes part of the official record. Claire logged every page. Scanned copies, original paper location, chain of custody, witness present, time recorded, nothing overlooked. 2 days later, Larry unexpectedly appeared at the estate office. The receptionist informed Claire. He says he wants 5 minutes. Margaret looked toward Claire. Your decision. Claire considered briefly. Send him in. Larry entered with practiced confidence, though fatigue now showed beneath his eyes. He looked around the room. Boxes, evidence binders, accounting files, independent investigators. His expression tightened. So this is what you've been doing. Claire closed the folder she had been reviewing. Estate administration. Larry laughed without humor. You've turned it into an audit. Thomas politely introduced himself. Forensic accounting specialist. Larry looked directly at Claire. You hired investigators, Margaret answered before Claire could. The estate retained independent experts. Larry ignored her. He kept his attention fixed on Claire. You could stop this. Claire remained calm. I could only stop it by violating my legal duty. This is unnecessary. I don't know that. There isn't anything to find. Claire answered quietly. Then the review will confirm that. Larry stepped closer. You don't trust me. For the first time since Richard's will had been read, Claire's expression softened. This process isn't about trust. Larry stared at her. It's about verification. She paused. Your father made that decision. Larry looked around the room once more. Every document, every investigator, every procedure. For the first time, he realized the estate review had grown far beyond a routine legal formality. It had become an independent examination of every financial decision connected to Richard Bennett's final years. And unlike family arguments or boardroom politics, accounting records possessed no loyalty. Emails had no emotions. Bank transfers had no opinions. They simply preserved the choices people believed no one would ever examine. As Larry quietly walked out of the office, Thomas looked toward Claire. He seemed worried. Claire slowly closed another evidence binder. I don't know what he's feeling. She glanced at the growing wall of organized files. But I know one thing. Thomas waited. The documents are beginning to answer questions faster than we can ask them. Neither of them realized that among the remaining unopened archive boxes lay a digital voice recorder Richard Bennett had personally instructed Daniel Brooks to preserve. Inside it was a conversation that would soon explain why Richard had trusted Claire with his final responsibility and why Larry's greatest mistake had never been believing he would inherit. It had been believing no one was paying attention. The digital voice recorder remained inside a sealed evidence envelope for nearly 2 days before anyone touched it. Claire Evans Bennett deliberately left it unopened, not because she lacked curiosity, because curiosity had never been the standard governing Richard Bennett's estate. Procedure had. Margaret Sullivan insisted every newly discovered item be logged before examination. Daniel Brooks completed the evidence inventory. Thomas Gallagher photographed the envelope from every angle. The seal was intact. Richard's handwriting appeared across the front. Recorded at my request. Open only if required during estate administration. No date, no explanation, only instructions. Claire signed the evidence log before sliding the envelope across the table to Margaret. Margaret looked around the room. For the record, does anyone object to opening the recording? No one spoke. The recorder was carefully removed and connected to a speaker. Margaret pressed play. For several seconds only, the faint sound of someone adjusting the recorder filled the room. Then Richard Bennett's familiar voice emerged, steady, calm, a little weaker than everyone remembered, but unmistakably his. "If you're listening to this," a brief pause followed. "Then I am no longer here to answer questions myself." Daniel lowered his eyes. Hearing Richard's voice again after weeks of silence felt unexpectedly painful. Richard continued, "I dislike leaving explanations after death." Another pause. "I've always preferred difficult conversations, while people can still answer back." A faint chuckle escaped the recording. "But some conversations become impossible." The room remained perfectly still. Richard's breathing was audible between sentences. "I know my decision regarding the executor will surprise many people. It may disappoint my son. It may burden Claire. It may even confuse those who believe inheritance and responsibility should always belong to the same person." Another silence. "I disagree." Margaret glanced briefly toward Claire. Claire kept her attention fixed on the recorder. She had never heard these words before. Richard continued, "The executor's responsibility is not to reward family. It is to protect fairness. I have spent my life building Bennett Holdings. I know where every building stands. I know every major customer. I know every acquisition. And most importantly," his voice softened, "I know the character of the people closest to me." Daniel quietly closed his notebook. He remembered Richard saying similar words months earlier in the garden. But hearing them preserved forever carried a different weight. Richard continued, "I have watched Claire Evans Bennett for years. She has never once asked me for authority, never once requested ownership, never once suggested she deserved recognition. I have also watched her correct mistakes without seeking credit. She reads before signing. She asks before assuming. She documents before concluding. Those habits are not exciting. They are exactly what an executor requires." Claire felt her throat tighten, not because Richard had praised her, because he had noticed things she never imagined anyone had seen. The recording continued, "My decision should never be interpreted as punishment toward Larry." Another pause. "I love my son. I always will. But love cannot replace judgment, especially where legal responsibility is concerned." The room grew even quieter. Richard took a slow breath before speaking again. "Over the last several years, I have repeatedly observed Larry making decisions before gathering complete information. He assumes outcomes. He celebrates plans before verifying facts. In business, that creates risk. In estate administration," his voice became firmer, "it creates injustice." Thomas Gallagher looked toward Margaret. Neither interrupted the recording. Richard continued, "If Larry believes this appointment reflects lack of trust." A pause. "He should understand something. I trusted him with opportunities. I did not trust him with restraint." Those words lingered in the room long after Richard finished the sentence. The recording eventually ended. No dramatic revelation, no accusation, no discussion of missing money, only Richard's reasoning. Margaret turned off the speaker. "For the record," she looked around the room, "this recording explains the executor appointment. It does not establish financial misconduct." Thomas nodded. "Correct." Claire appreciated the clarification. Richard's personal opinions mattered. Evidence still mattered more. That afternoon, Larry requested another meeting. This time, he came alone. Margaret allowed him inside the conference room. He noticed the recorder immediately. "You listened to it?" Margaret answered honestly, "Yes." Larry looked toward Claire. "So he really explained everything?" "He explained his decision. Larry laughed bitterly. I suppose I failed another test. Claire remained silent. Larry looked at her again. What did he say about me? Margaret answered before Claire could. Richard's private comments are now part of the estate record. I asked Claire. Claire met his eyes calmly. Your father loved you. Larry looked away. That's not what I asked. No. Claire's voice remained gentle. But it's still true. For several seconds, Larry said nothing. Then he quietly asked, Did he ever tell you he was making you executor? Claire shook her head. Never. You expect me to believe that? You don't have to. Larry studied her face. He searched for triumph, vindication, satisfaction. He found none. Only the same quiet composure that had always frustrated him. I've been thinking, Larry finally said. About what? Maybe we should simplify all this. Margaret folded her hands. What do you mean? Larry leaned forward. The estate review. Claire waited. If there are accounting questions, he shrugged. I'll explain them. Thomas spoke for the first time. Explanation doesn't replace documentation. Larry frowned. I wasn't speaking to you. Thomas remained calm. I'm the court-approved forensic accountant. Larry turned back toward Claire. You know me. Claire answered quietly. Yes. You know I wouldn't intentionally damage my father's company. Claire considered the statement carefully. I know you care deeply about building your own future. Larry waited. She continued. I don't yet know whether every decision protected your father's. Again, not accusation, not defense. Only uncertainty honestly acknowledged. Larry exhaled slowly. This is unbelievable. Over the following week, Thomas expanded the financial review. Several outside vendors received requests for confirmation. Travel agencies verified reservations. Luxury hotels confirmed guest records. Corporate credit card providers supplied transaction metadata. Every response either confirmed existing documents or raised additional questions. Claire maintained a master timeline across one entire wall. Blue markers represented verified facts. Yellow markers represented unresolved issues. Green markers represented completed reviews. No red markers existed. Daniel eventually asked why. You've never used red. Claire looked toward the timeline. Red suggests certainty. And we aren't finished. 3 days later, another witness voluntarily contacted the estate. Her name was Olivia Martinez. She had served as executive travel coordinator for Bennett Holdings before accepting another position 6 months earlier. Margaret invited her to provide a formal statement. Olivia appeared nervous. I don't want trouble. Margaret reassured her. We only want accuracy. Olivia nodded. I handled travel bookings. Claire opened a notebook. Can you explain the reimbursement process? Olivia described the normal procedures in detail. Then she hesitated. There were exceptions. Thomas looked up. What kind? Sometimes Mr. Bennett. She corrected herself. Mr. Larry Bennett? Asked me to book personal travel using temporary business classifications. Silence settled across the room. Claire asked carefully, Did you question those requests? A few times. What happened? He said supporting paperwork would be updated later. Thomas wrote several notes. Claire asked another question. Were the updates completed? Olivia lowered her eyes. I don't know. Again, useful information, not final proof. Claire thanked her for her honesty before ending the interview. That evening, Daniel remained behind after everyone else left. He stood looking at the growing timeline covering almost an entire wall. "I've worked for Richard 25 years. Claire joined him. He believed details mattered. Daniel smiled faintly. He believed character mattered even more. He looked toward her. "I think I finally understand why he chose you." Claire remained quiet. Daniel continued. "Most people investigating someone begin hoping to prove something." He gestured toward the timeline. "You keep looking for reasons to be wrong." Claire smiled gently. "My father taught me something." "What?" "If the truth is real," she looked at the neatly organized evidence, "it doesn't need my help." Outside the office windows, evening settled over Columbus. Inside, another package had just been delivered by certified courier. It contained additional banking metadata requested from the financial institution handling Bennett Holdings' executive accounts. Thomas would review it the following morning. No one yet realized those records would connect multiple reimbursement changes to a single sequence of electronic authorizations, made only hours after Richard Bennett had entered the hospital during one of his most serious medical emergencies. The timing would not prove intent, but it would raise a question no one, not even Larry Bennett, would be able to ignore. The banking metadata, Taïd Sus, arrived at 8:17 a.m. in an encrypted file transfer. Thomas Gallagher was the first to open it. He did not speak for several minutes. Claire Evans Bennett stood across the table waiting without pressure, her notebook already open but untouched. Daniel Brooks watched Thomas carefully, noting the slight change in his expression. Not alarm, not excitement. Something closer to recognition. Final, calmly, Thomas exhaled. "This is more structured than I expected." Claire asked calmly, "Structured how?" He rotated the screen toward her. "These are authorization timestamps." Claire leaned closer. Rows of data filled the display. Each line contained transaction ID approval source, modification timestamp, reimbursement category, destination account reference TOM, as pointed at a cluster of entries. "Look at this sequence." Claire followed his finger. Multiple reimbursements had been modified within a very narrow time window, all within hours of each other, all originating from the same executive approval system. Daniel frowned. "That seems fast." Thomas nodded. "It is." Claire did not react immediately. She compared timestamps against hospital records already included in the estate timeline. Then she paused. "These modifications occurred during Richard Bennett's emergency admission." Silence entered the room immediately. Thomas confirmed. "Yes." Margaret Sullivan, who had just arrived, stopped in the doorway. "Explain." Claire turned the screen toward her. Reimbursement descriptions were updated during a hospital emergency window. Margaret reviewed the data carefully. "Are we saying someone accessed the system during that time?" Thomas answered cautiously. "We are saying the system logs show authorized access occurred." Daniel added quietly. "Authorized by whom?" Thomas scrolled further. The answer appeared on the next line. Larry Bennett. No one spoke for a moment, not because the name was shocking, but because the timing created a pattern that no longer felt coincidental. Margaret finally spoke. "This does not establish wrongdoing." Thomas agreed immediately. "Correct. It establishes sequence." Claire underlined the word sequence in her notebook. Sequence mattered more than interpretation. By midday, Margaret formally expanded the investigation scope. All financial modifications during the defined medical period will require forensic correlation with hospital records. Claire immediately began cross-referencing admission times. Daniel retrieved emergency room logs. Thomas expanded the data set. Michael Reed provided internal server access logs from Bennett Holdings financial systems. The timeline began forming across multiple screens. Hospital admission timestamps, system login records, reimbursement modifications, bank authorization confirmations. Placed side by side, the structure revealed something increasingly difficult to ignore. Not a single anomaly. A repeated pattern of activity occurring during restricted periods of physical presence. Claire did not speak until she had verified each correlation twice. Then she said quietly, "This is consistent across multiple instances." Margaret nodded. "It is." Daniel leaned forward. "Consistent with what?" Margaret answered carefully. "With a single user modifying financial classifications during sensitive time frames." No one used stronger language. No one said intent. No one said fraud. Because at this stage, the estate required precision, not conclusion. That afternoon, Larry Bennett arrived without prior notice. He entered the office quickly, scanning the room before speaking. "I heard there are new claims." Margaret did not respond immediately. Thomas closed his laptop. Claire remained seated. Larry looked at her first. "You've escalated this further." Claire answered calmly. "The process requires verification." "Verification of what?" Thomas spoke. "Financial modification logs." Larry turned toward him. "I wasn't talking to you." Thomas remained composed. "The data involves system-wide financial records." Larry ignored him and focused again on Claire. "You think I manipulated accounting entries?" Claire shook her head slightly. "I don't think anything yet." Larry let out a short, frustrated breath. "This is ridiculous." Margaret finally intervened. "Mr. Bennett, no conclusion has been made." Larry gestured toward the screens. "Then why does it look like I'm being accused?" Claire answered immediately. "It doesn't look like anything yet." She paused. "It looks like a timeline." That answer irritated him more than confrontation would have, because it removed emotion from the discussion entirely. Larry stepped closer to the table. "Do you know what I was doing during those timestamps?" Thomas replied neutrally. "We are verifying that now." Larry turned toward Claire. "You were at the hospital." Claire met his eyes. "Yes." "You saw how unstable everything was." "I did." "So you think I was sitting there manipulating spreadsheets while my father was dying?" Claire's voice remained steady. "I think we are reviewing system logs." Larry shook his head. "You've lost perspective." Margaret spoke firmly. "Mr. Bennett, this meeting is not for interpretation." He looked at her. "Then what is it for?" "Establishing facts." Silence followed. Larry slowly looked around the room again. Every screen displayed data he had not anticipated would be reviewed in this way. Every file pointed toward a structured sequence of administrative changes. Finally, he spoke more quietly. "I didn't manipulate anything." Claire wrote that statement exactly as he said it, noted without judgment. Margaret nodded. "That statement will be recorded." Larry looked briefly relieved, but only briefly, because Thomas then added, "Further verification will continue across all related accounts." Meaning nothing was closed, nothing was resolved, nothing was decided. After Larry left, the room remained silent for a long time. Daniel finally spoke. "He thinks this is about him." Margaret answered without looking up. "It is about actions." Claire closed her notebook. "Not assumptions." Thomas leaned back. "The data is not complete yet." Margaret agreed, "but it is consistent enough to justify continued review." Claire quietly added, "Consistency is the beginning of pattern recognition." Daniel looked at her. And a pattern recognition leads to... Claire paused. Understanding. She did not say guilt. She did not say innocence. Only understanding. Over the next several days, Thomas expanded the analysis into external vendor systems. Hotel booking platforms were subpoenaed for historical access records. Airline reservation systems confirmed passenger manifests. Credit card processors released merchant-level transaction metadata. Each layer added detail. Each detail added structure. Claire maintained strict separation between verified and pending data. Blue markers for confirmed facts, yellow markers for incomplete data. No emotional interpretation entered the system. Margaret observed this carefully. You are not reacting. Claire answered simply. Reaction comes after certainty, and if certainty never comes quickly, then we wait. Margaret nodded slightly. Richard would have approved that answer. Claire hesitated for the first time. I hope I'm doing this the way he intended. Margaret studied her for a moment. He chose you because you would not rush to interpret what you had not yet proven. That statement lingered longer than expected. Late one evening, Daniel stayed behind after everyone left. He stood in front of the expanded timeline wall. Now, it stretched nearly the entire length of the room. Dozens of connected financial events, hospital timestamps, system logs, reimbursement modifications, vendor confirmations. He spoke quietly. I used to think estate work was about distributing assets. Claire stood beside him. It is. Daniel shook his head slightly. Not like this. He gestured toward the wall. This feels like reconstructing decisions people thought would never be reviewed. Claire nodded. That is exactly what it is. Daniel looked at her. Does it ever bother you? She considered the question. It would be dangerous if it didn't. He gave a small, understanding smile. That sounds like something Richard would say. Claire looked down at her notebook. He said something similar once. Daniel waited. Facts should never depend on comfort. As they prepared to leave, a final encrypted file arrived from the financial institution. Thomas reopened the system. The file contained a summary correlation report. He read it slowly. Then again. Claire watched him carefully. What does it show? Thomas did not answer immediately. Instead, he rotated the screen so everyone could see. A structured pattern appeared. Multiple financial modifications, multiple reimbursements, multiple timestamps, all linked through a shared authentication pathway. Margaret stepped closer. Explain simply. Thomas spoke carefully. It shows a consistent administrative authorization pattern across all reviewed transactions. He paused, centered on a single executive login profile. Larry Bennett. The room became completely still, not because anyone had reached a conclusion, but because the investigation had now moved from scattered irregularities into something structurally unified, a system, a pattern, a traceable sequence of decisions. Claire closed her notebook slowly. This is no longer isolated, Margaret nodded. It is beginning to form context. Daniel looked at the wall of evidence. And context eventually leads to, Margaret answered quietly, accountability. Outside, the city lights of Columbus reflected faintly against the office windows. Inside, no one celebrated, no one accused, no one concluded. But for the first time since Richard Bennett's death, every person in the room understood the same uncomfortable truth. The estate was no longer simply distributing wealth. It was uncovering the full story of how that wealth had been handled in its final years. And somewhere inside that story, still unspoken and not yet fully assembled, was a decision Richard Bennett had made long before anyone else realized the importance of watching closely. The rain returned to Columbus on the morning the forensic report reached its preliminary conclusion. It fell steadily without thunder or drama, as if the sky itself had decided not to interfere with what was unfolding inside the walls of Sullivan and Hale. Claire Evans Bennett arrived early. Earlier than Thomas Gallagher, earlier than Margaret Sullivan, earlier than Daniel Brooks. She sat alone for nearly 20 minutes reviewing the consolidated timeline on the wall. Blue markers, yellow markers, now a few green confirmations added by external verification sources. The pattern no longer looked scattered. It looked structured, not chaotic, not random, intentional in its repetition, even if intent itself still required legal confirmation. Claire wrote one line in her notebook: consistency confirmed across systems. Nothing more, no interpretation, no emotion, only record. At 9:14 a.m., Thomas arrived carrying a sealed forensic summary. He did not place it on the table immediately. Instead, he stood near the door for a moment, as if adjusting to the weight of what he was holding. Margaret noticed. Report complete. Thomas nodded once. Preliminary conclusion. Daniel closed the file he had been reading. Claire looked up. Thomas placed the document on the table carefully. This is not a final legal judgment. Margaret responded immediately. It never is at this stage. Thomas opened the report, but it is a consolidated analysis of all verified financial activity reviewed to date. Silence settled. Even the sound of rain outside seemed distant. He began reading. Across all examined transactions within the defined estate review period, a consistent authorization pattern has been identified. He paused briefly. Multiple financial modifications, reimbursements, and expense reclassifications were executed using a singular executive authentication profile. Daniel already knew what was coming. Still hearing it stated formally changed the atmosphere in the room. Thomas continued. These actions correspond chronologically with periods during which Richard Bennett was hospitalized or medically incapacitated. No one interrupted. Not even Larry Bennett, who had arrived only minutes earlier and now stood near the back of the room, arms crossed, expression unreadable. Thomas turned a page. External vendor confirmations, internal system logs, and banking metadata all corroborate identical authorization pathways. He looked up briefly. This establishes consistency, not intent. Margaret nodded. Correct. Thomas continued. However, the timing correlation between medical emergency events and financial authorization activity is statistically significant and requires further legal interpretation. Larry finally spoke. Interpretation. His voice was controlled but tight. That's a nice word for speculation. Thomas answered calmly. It is the opposite of speculation. It is structured correlation. Larry took a step forward. So you're saying what exactly? Margaret intervened. We are saying what the data shows. Larry laughed once. This is absurd. He turned toward Claire. You're sitting here letting them build a case out of timing. Claire met his gaze. We are reviewing records. Larry's frustration sharpened. You're treating me like I did something criminal. Claire answered evenly. No one has made that determination. Then stop acting like it. Claire hesitated briefly, then responded, I am not acting. That simple sentence silenced him more effectively than confrontation ever could. Margaret raised a hand. This meeting is not for argument. Larry exhaled sharply, but said nothing further. Thomas resumed. There is one additional finding. The room shifted slightly. Even Daniel straightened. Thomas turned the page. A subset of transactions show post-approval modification entries. Margaret frowned. Explain. Thomas pointed at the screen. Initial expense descriptions were altered after authorization. Claire leaned forward slightly. Meaning the original classification submitted for approval was different from the final recorded category. Silence again, this time heavier. Larry spoke more slowly. That happens in accounting. Thomas nodded. Occasionally, yes. Claire immediately asked. Frequency. Thomas checked the report. In this dataset, significantly above baseline expectation. Margaret leaned back slightly. And who executed the modifications? Thomas looked at the final column. Executive Authentication Profile associated with Larry Bennett. The room did not react loudly. There were no gasps, no accusations, only stillness. Because everyone understood something important. This was no longer about isolated discrepancies. It was about system behavior. Larry stared at the screen. For several seconds, he said nothing. Then he spoke quietly. You're saying I changed descriptions? Thomas answered carefully. The system logs show your authorized credentials were used. Larry shook his head. I never altered accounting entries like that. Margaret spoke calmly. Then the question becomes whether those credentials were used directly or indirectly. Larry turned toward her. What does that even mean? Claire answered without emotion. Access delegation credential reuse or automated system approval routing. Larry let out a short, bitter breath. So now we're inventing technical loopholes. Thomas immediately corrected him. We are identifying possible explanations for logged activity. Larry stepped closer to the table. I have run that company for years. Margaret responded firmly, and that is precisely why everything is being verified. Silence again, but different this time. Tense, focused, no longer theoretical. Claire quietly opened her notebook. She wrote one line. Post-approval modification frequency above expected threshold. She underlined it once, not as accusation, as classification. Daniel watched her. You're not reacting at all. Claire didn't look up. If I react now, I risk misclassifying what still needs verification. Daniel nodded slowly. Richard's influence was unmistakable in her method. Margaret closed the forensic report. This document will be submitted to probate court. Larry reacted immediately. So that's it. You're escalating this legally? Margaret answered without hesitation. It already is a legal process. Larry looked at Claire again. You're letting this happen. Claire finally met his eyes fully. I am executing my duty. Larry's voice lowered. I am your husband. The words hung in the air longer than anything else said that morning. Claire paused, then answered quietly, That does not change procedural responsibility. Larry blinked once. Something in his expression shifted. Not anger now, confusion. Because nothing he said was influencing the direction of the room anymore. Not emotion, not relationship, not expectation, only documentation. After Larry left abruptly, the room remained silent. Daniel finally spoke. He thinks this is about him personally. Margaret shook her head. It stopped being personal the moment logs were verified. Thomas added, It became structural. Claire closed her notebook. And structure doesn't negotiate. Margaret looked at her. Correct. That afternoon, an additional development emerged. Michael Reed entered the office carrying a new external audit response. I got confirmation from the bank. He placed the document on the table. Claire opened it immediately. It contained metadata reconciliation between internal authorization systems and external banking confirmations. She read slowly, then stopped. Daniel noticed her pause. What is it? Claire turned the page toward him. There was one repeated anomaly, a synchronization delay between internal approval timestamps and external bank execution logs. Thomas leaned in. Explain that, Michael answered. It means approvals were recorded internally before the external transaction finalized. Margaret frowned. Normal, Michael hesitated. Within range, but not consistent across all entries. Thomas added, inconsistent timing alignment can indicate manual override, delayed processing, or batch authorization routing. Larry's earlier statement echoed indirectly through the room. Technical possibilities, not conclusions, but patterns accumulating nonetheless. Claire stood and walked to the timeline wall. She placed a green marker on the newest verified pattern cluster, then stepped back. The wall was now densely mapped. Every financial discrepancy, every timing correlation, every authorization pathway. Not labeled as guilt, not labeled as innocence, only structured relationships between actions and timestamps. Daniel stood beside her. It doesn't look like isolated mistakes anymore. Claire nodded. It hasn't for a while. Daniel looked at her. Then what is it? Claire paused for a long moment. Something that requires explanation we do not yet have. That evening, after everyone left, Claire remained alone in the office. Rain continued outside. She reviewed Richard Bennett's voice recording again. Not the emotional parts, the procedural parts. Facts should never depend on comfort. She closed her notebook slowly. Across the room, the forensic report lay sealed again for court submission. On top of it, a single line had been added by Margaret. Further legal determination required. Claire looked at it for a long time. Not satisfied, not unsettled. Simply aware that the process had reached a stage where evidence was no longer fragmented. It was converging. And when convergence happened in legal investigations of this scale, outcomes were rarely determined by interpretation. They were determined by what remained unexplainable after every document had been examined. Outside, thunder finally rolled in the distance. Inside, Claire turned off the light. And for the first time since Richard Bennett's death, the estate was no longer asking whether something had happened. It was beginning to ask something far more serious. How much of it could be proven in a court of law? The courthouse filings were submitted on a quiet Tuesday morning without ceremony and without press announcements. Margaret Sullivan believed that the law did not require spectacle to be effective. It required clarity. Claire Evans Bennett agreed. Larry Bennett did not attend the submission. He had not been invited, not because he was excluded from relevance, but because probate procedure required formal stages, and that stage belonged to the estate administrator and legal counsel. Still by noon, Larry already knew. Information always traveled faster than procedure in a family as visible as the Bennetts. Claire received the notification while reviewing a final batch of reconciled transaction logs. Margaret placed the court acknowledgement letter on the table. It's official. Claire looked up. Accepted. Filed and acknowledged. Daniel exhaled quietly. Thomas closed his laptop. Michael Reed simply nodded. No celebration followed, only confirmation. Because filing did not conclude anything. It only moved the process into judicial oversight. By afternoon, Larry arrived at Sullivan and Hale. He did not wait in reception. He walked directly into the estate office, no longer asking permission. Margaret stood immediately. This is a legal workspace. Larry ignored her. I just received notice. Claire remained seated. So did we. Larry looked directly at her. You filed against me. Claire answered calmly. We submitted financial findings to probate court for review. Larry shook his head. This is insane. Thomas spoke quietly. It is standard procedure when financial discrepancies exceed internal resolution thresholds. Larry turned toward him. I didn't ask you. Thomas did not react. Claire finally stood. This is not an accusation. Larry laughed sharply. Then what is it? Claire paused. A review. The simplicity of the answer frustrated him more than confrontation, because it refused to give him an emotional target. Margaret intervened. Mr. Bennett, you are not under indictment. Larry turned to her. Yet. Silence followed. Not agreement, not denial. Just acknowledgement that escalation had entered a formal pathway. Margaret continued. The court has requested full preservation of all relevant financial records pending review. Larry exhaled slowly. So now everything is frozen. Only under legal preservation requirements. He looked toward Claire again. You're still doing this? Claire answered without hesitation. It is my legal obligation. Larry's expression tightened. You really believe this is just paperwork? Claire met his eyes. I believe it is documentation. A pause. And documentation determines outcome. That sentence lingered, because it did not accuse him. It simply described the system they were now inside. Over the next several days, Bennett Holdings entered an unusual state of suspended motion. Not operationally frozen, but structurally cautious. The board reduced discretionary approvals. Legal counsel requested internal audits. Financial departments slowed non-essential transactions. Every executive knew something had shifted, even if no official announcement confirmed it. Claire continued working from the estate office. Her focus narrowed. Not expanding, not escalating, consolidating. She organized every verified financial record into a court-ready index. Each document received source verification, timestamp validation, chain of custody confirmation system origin mapping. Daniel observed her method carefully. You're preparing this like a trial exhibit. Claire did not look up. It may become one. Daniel hesitated. Do you think it will? Claire paused. I think it will become whatever the evidence requires. No emotion, no prediction, only structure. Thomas Gallagher expanded his forensic scope again. External auditors were brought in under court authorization. They began revalidating bank pathways independently. One afternoon, Thomas called Claire over. I need you to see this. She approached. He displayed a consolidated flow diagram. Multiple transaction streams, multiple approval nodes, but one shared convergence point. Claire studied it. Single authorization cluster. Thomas nodded. Correct. Michael leaned closer. What does that mean in practical terms? Thomas answered carefully. It means multiple financial actions were processed through a unified approval pathway rather than separate departmental approvals. Daniel frowned. Is that normal? Thomas shook his head slightly. It can happen in centralized executive control systems, Margaret added. But consistency matters. Thomas agreed. And this level of consistency across unrelated categories is statistically unusual. Claire wrote in her notebook, centralized authorization pathway confirmed across multiple transaction types. She underlined it once. Not conclusion, observation. Meanwhile, Larry's position inside Bennett Holdings became increasingly complicated. He was still publicly recognized as the founder's son, still technically an executive officer. But internal caution had begun altering how colleagues interacted with him. Requests were delayed. Approvals required additional review. Meetings included legal observers, Larry noticed, and it frustrated him. One evening, he confronted Michael Reed in the hallway. "You're slowing everything down." Michael responded carefully. "I'm following compliance instructions." Larry stepped closer. "From Claire." Michael did not deny it. Larry shook his head. "This is exactly what I was afraid of." Michael replied quietly, "No." Larry looked at him sharply. "This is what governance looks like when it is finally enforced properly." Larry walked away without responding. At home, the distance between Larry and Claire widened further. They spoke less about daily matters, less about anything personal. One evening, Larry entered the kitchen while Claire was reviewing court documentation. He watched her silently for a moment. "You're building a case against me." Claire did not look up immediately. "When did I say that?" "You didn't have to." She closed the folder. "This is an estate review." Larry shook his head. "It feels like something else." Claire answered simply, "Feelings are not evidence." That sentence struck harder than argument, because it removed emotional interpretation entirely. Larry sat down across from her. "Do you even realize what this is doing to us?" Claire looked at him quietly. "I am aware of the process. That's not what I asked." She paused, then answered honestly, "I am not mixing roles." Larry frowned. "What roles?" "Executor." A pause. "Wife." The separation was clear, not emotional, structural. Larry leaned back slowly. "So you choose this over me?" Claire answered immediately. "I did not choose anything over you." She looked at him directly. "I am fulfilling a legal responsibility assigned by your father." Larry laughed bitterly. "So he trusted you more than me." Claire did not respond to the comparison, because it was not part of her function. 2 days later, another major development emerged. A supplemental forensic report arrived from Thomas Gallagher. He requested an emergency meeting. Everyone gathered: Margaret, Claire, Daniel, Michael. Larry arrived uninvited shortly after. Thomas began immediately. "We identified an additional layer of transaction routing data." He projected a visual map. Claire studied it carefully. "Explain." Thomas pointed. Certain reimbursement modifications were not only authorized through a single executive profile. He paused. Yeah, they were also routed through a secondary approval interface tied to system-level administrative access. Margaret frowned. "Meaning?" Thomas answered carefully. "It suggests dual-layer authorization capability." Larry stepped forward. "So now I supposedly hacked the system," Thomas responded calmly. "No one is claiming that." Claire added quietly, "We are identifying system behavior." Larry shook his head. "This is getting ridiculous." Margaret spoke firmly. "Mr. Bennett's speculation is not permitted in this room." Larry looked at her. "Then explain what this is." Thomas answered, "Evidence requiring interpretation." Silence followed. Not agreement and not conclusion. Only the growing realization that the system had more complexity than originally assumed. After Larry left again, Daniel remained behind. He looked at Claire. "This is expanding faster than I expected." Claire nodded. It was always going to expand. Daniel frowned. How did Richard know this would happen? Claire paused. then answered quietly, "Because he didn't design the system for simplicity." She looked at the files. "He designed it for accountability." Margaret closed her folder. "And accountability always takes time," Thomas added. "And time reveals structure." Claire wrote one final line in her notebook before closing it. System behavior converging toward complete audit visibility. No interpretation, only direction. That night, Claire remained alone in the office after everyone left. She reviewed Richard Bennett's recorded message again. This time, she did not focus on words. She focused on tone, the calm certainty, the absence of hesitation, the belief that truth did not need speed, only persistence. She closed the file slowly. Outside, the city lights reflected faintly against the glass. Inside, Claire looked at the wall of evidence. What had once been scattered anomalies now formed a structured map of financial activity spanning years. Not yet a conclusion, not yet a verdict, but no longer random. And somewhere within that structure, still not fully visible but increasingly unavoidable, was the reality that Larry Bennett's certainty had always been built on assumption. And assumption in legal systems designed like Richard Bennett's was never enough to survive scrutiny. The final hearing did not feel like an ending. It felt like the last layer being removed from something that had been unfolding long before anyone in the room understood its full shape. The courthouse was quiet that morning, not because the case lacked importance, but because every participant had already learned the same lesson in different ways. In matters governed by documentation, silence often replaced speculation. Claire Evans Bennett arrived early as she always did. She did not sit at the front. She did not sit at the back. She sat where the record would place her neutrally within the proceedings. Margaret Sullivan reviewed the final docket one last time. Thomas Gallagher organized his forensic summary. Michael Reed held the consolidated financial exhibit binder. Daniel Brooks checked timestamps for the recording system. Larry Bennett arrived last, no longer confident, not yet defeated, but visibly aware that something irreversible had already taken shape. He did not speak when he entered. He simply sat. The room acknowledged him without reaction. Not hostility, not sympathy, only procedural awareness. Margaret opened the session. The court will now review the final consolidated findings related to the Bennett estate administration. No one interrupted. Not Larry, not Claire, not anyone. Thomas began presenting the final forensic summary. Across all verified financial systems, we have confirmed a consistent pattern of executive-level authorization applied to multiple categories of reimbursement and financial reclassification. He paused. This includes travel vendor services and expense categorization adjustments. He turned a page. All modifications were executed through authenticated executive credentials associated with Larry Bennett. Larry exhaled slowly. This again. Margaret raised her hand slightly. This is not repetition. This is consolidation. Thomas continued. Independent audits confirmed that the transactions themselves are not inherently illegal in isolation. A brief pause. But their classification changes timing consistency and routing structure, fall outside standard corporate governance expectations. Claire listened without writing this time. She no longer needed to record every detail manually. Everything had already been indexed, Thomas concluded. The findings support administrative irregularity requiring governance resolution under probate oversight. No accusations, no verdict, only structure. Margaret turned toward Claire. As executor of the estate, you are required to confirm whether all financial obligations tied to the Bennett estate have been fully verified. Claire stood. Her voice remained steady. Based on current verified records, all financial activity associated with the estate has been reviewed, categorized, and cross-referenced. She paused. There are no remaining unverified asset streams. Margaret nodded. Do you certify that the estate review process has reached completion under current evidentiary standards? Claire looked once at the consolidated record, then answered, I certify that all available documentation has been reviewed in accordance with legal requirement. The room acknowledged the statement for the record. No applause, no reaction, only finality. Margaret closed the file. Then the estate administration phase under executor oversight is complete. A long silence followed. This was the moment Larry had expected for months, but it did not feel like victory. It felt like closure without reward. He looked at Claire. You're finished, Claire answered calmly. With the process. Larry frowned. What does that mean? Margaret responded before Claire could. It means the estate obligations are complete. Legal administration concludes here. She paused. Any remaining matters fall outside executor jurisdiction. Larry leaned back slowly. So that's it, Thomas added quietly. From a forensic standpoint, yes. Daniel closed his notebook. Michael placed the final binder on the table. Claire remained standing for a moment longer. Then she spoke. There is one final procedural action, Margaret nodded. Yes. Claire turned slightly toward Larry. As executor, I am required to ensure that all estate-related administrative access privileges are formally closed. Larry looked at her. What are you saying? Claire answered simply. System access tied to a state review authority will be revoked. He stared at her. Now, immediately following court confirmation. Margaret confirmed. That is correct. Larry gave a short laugh, but it carried no humor. So I lose access to everything. Claire responded without emotion. Access related to estate administration. Larry looked around the room, and for the first time he realized something fundamental. This was not a loss. It was separation, a legal boundary finally enforced. After the hearing concluded, people began leaving one by one. Thomas first, then Michael, then Daniel. Margaret remained briefly with Claire. You handled this exactly as Richard intended. Claire hesitated. I don't know if I understood everything he intended. Margaret answered gently. You understood the only part that mattered. Claire looked at her. Which is, Margaret closed her briefcase, that truth does not require speed. She left. Larry remained seated. Claire approached only when the room was nearly empty. For a long moment, neither spoke. Finally, Larry said quietly, You never once tried to use this against me. Claire answered immediately. That was never my role. He looked at her. Even now. Even now. Larry nodded slowly, then asked something softer. Did he ever tell you why he chose you? Claire considered. No. Larry gave a faint, tired smile. That sounds like him. She looked at him for a moment longer than usual. Your father did not choose me because he expected conflict. She paused. He chose me because he expected process. Larry looked down. And I failed that. Claire did not respond to the word failed, because it was not part of her function to assign judgment. Instead, she said something simpler. The system does not require perfection. Larry looked up. What does it require? Claire answered quietly. Correction when necessary. A long silence followed. Not hostile, not reconciliatory, just final. Outside the courthouse, daylight had shifted. The case was no longer active. The estate no longer under review. Legally, everything was complete. Claire stepped out alone. The air felt different, not lighter, not heavier, just finished. Daniel joined her a moment later. "You're leaving." "I've completed my role." He nodded slowly. "Do you feel different?" Claire considered the question carefully. "No." A pause. "Only quieter." Daniel smiled faintly. Richard would have approved of that answer too. Claire looked toward the street. I think he already knew what the answer would be. Later that evening, Claire returned to the Bennett estate one final time. Not as executor, not as legal administrator, only to collect her personal belongings. The house felt unchanged, but empty in a different way. Larry was not there. The silence was not emotional. It was structural. She walked through the library, the sunroom, the hallway where Richard used to stand reviewing documents. She stopped briefly where she had once written notes during hospital visits. No memories needed revisiting. They were already complete. On the desk, she placed the final signed closure document. Then she wrote one last line in her personal notebook. Estate administration completed. All obligations fulfilled. She closed it and left it on the desk. Not as legacy, not as symbol, just record. Outside, the evening air was still. Claire did not look back when she stepped out of the house. Not because she wanted distance, because nothing unresolved remained to look back at. The Bennett estate would continue. The company would continue. Larry Bennett would continue. But the legal structure surrounding Richard Bennett's final wishes had reached its conclusion. And in that conclusion, there was no victory speech, no public resolution, no emotional collapse. Only a system that had done exactly what it was designed to do. Revealed truth through process. As Claire walked down the driveway, she understood something quietly. Richard Bennett had not given her power. He had given her responsibility. And responsibility, once completed properly, did not demand recognition. It only demanded completion. Behind her, the house lights remained on. Ahead of her, the road continued without interruption. And for the first time since Richard Bennett's death, there was nothing left to verify. Only life continuing in its simplest form. Without assumption, without procedure, without question.